Pete, welcome to Mind Body Solution. I want you to, as a beginning for this podcast, try to frame your thoughts nice and coherently with regards to the mind-body problem. I want you to start at the very beginning, and I want you to give us a nice philosophical history of the mind-body problem. And the reason why I want you to do this is that it allows you to give us an idea of which aspects of this mind-body problem regarding the history was important to you and helped frame your views moving to this point. So let's hear it.
Wow. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be a guest on your podcast. Now, you start there with a big question. Perhaps the biggest question in philosophy, the mind-body problem and its history. Now, when we talk about history in philosophy, there are multiple histories of philosophy. There are the histories you get in the popular textbooks, the histories sometimes that we teach our students, which are often caricatures. Then you get the history that the serious historians of philosophy do, and they say, no, you've got Descartes all wrong, and you've got that's not how it went. And the fact is, the history is immensely complex, and any simple story you tell about it will distort it. Although it may pick out one thread that was really there and did influence people. And the other a thing that has happened is that because sometimes the caricatures and the simplistic stories have been repeated so often, that they have become more influential than the reality, than what philosophers actually thought. So, where do I start with it? So what I'll tell you is my little story, if you like. We always tend to start with Descartes when doing philosophy of mind, though it's no reason why we shouldn't start a lot earlier than that. But Descartes is certainly a good place for me to start, because I feel that a lot of what I'm doing is trying to resist a kind of way of thinking about the mind that takes a lot of inspiration from Descartes and is often just called loosely Cartesian. And I suppose you could say that this is the conception of the mind as some sort of private world, all of its own, that is better known to us than anything else. We inhabit this private mental world of thoughts and feelings and experiences, and that's our real fundamental reality. And everything else, the world outside, other people, the universe, is something we infer from that, what's happening in our private mental world. And maybe some people thought there isn't any outside reality. There's just this private mental world and other people's private mental worlds. It's idealism. And that's a view that certainly finds inspiration in Descartes, because of course Descartes did this famous thing of asking what he could really be sure of, the method of doubt, and the one thing that he felt he could be absolutely sure of. Couldn't be sure that there was a God, there was a world, but he could be sure of his own what was happening in his own private mental world. And then, of course, as soon as you start to frame the mind in this way as this private mental world, then you immediately, and Descartes was well aware that you have a problem of saying how this private mental world is related to the rest of reality, assuming there is an external world, there is a universe, and there is an earth, and there are other people. How is my private mental world related to that? For one thing, Descartes thought this, they seem to be totally different kinds of things. The private mental world is a world of pure thought. It doesn't have any extension. It doesn't take up space. It's pure thought. And the world out there is just kind of extended stuff. It's matter arranged in various ways. And how do these two things, it seems that we affect the world out there and that the world out there affects us, but how does that work? And so you get these problems. And so then there's a history of people trying to deal with that problem, proposing ways in which the mind and body could interact.
It is at that point where Dennett often talks about. I mean, that's exactly where the split, once the Cartesian split occurs, we're basically running down a certain direction, and we cannot stop at that point. And I think that's pretty much where your problem with the mind-body problem lies.
I think so, because I think, and you mentioned Dennett there. Yeah, yes, I think, yes. Well, yes, and I'm very much a follower of Dennett. And what Dennett thinks has happened, and I think he's right about this, is that for a long time it was quite possible to think that this private mental world is an immaterial soul, something like that. It's a separate thing. So that we were bodies, which were part of this external world, and then we were also souls. In fact, we were what we really were. What each of us really was a soul, and we had a body, but that wasn't essential, because when we die, the soul would continue to live, to exist without the body. And so it was quite possible to think, yes, there is this separate mental world. It's the soul, and religion tells us that's true. And there was not a lot of pressure from science yet to reject that view. But then, gradually, as you start to have a science of the brain, as you start to develop the natural science, and particularly neuroscience, through the 19th century into the 20th century, it became very, very hard to maintain that view, because it was increasingly obvious that the mind depended intimately on things happening in the brain. And if the brain stops to functioning in the way it should, your mind goes, your memories go, your ability to speak go, your perceptual abilities are damaged, and so on and so on. And scientists began to work out which bits of the brain are actually responsible for these things. And it began to look increasingly like as if there just was the brain, and everything that all the signs of the mind, or the reactions and so on that were associated with mind are just being produced by the brain. So what happens then to the mind and to this private inner world? And so really the progress of 20th century philosophy of mind was very much again, one strand in that history that you can tell is that philosophers were trying to explain what we're doing when we talk about the mind. If we're not talking about an immaterial soul, what are we talking about? Mm-hmm. Are we talking about nothing at all? Some eliminativists suggested that really this mind talk isn't picking out anything at all, and we should just go and ask the neuroscientists to tell us how to describe how to explain people's behavior.
And that's specifically Paul and Patricia Churchland. I mean, they're
the most famous advocates of that. Mm. Others said that, well, really all we're doing when we talk about people's minds, about their beliefs and their desires and so on, is we're sort of characterizing how they're disposed to behave. Just as if you say that somebody's an angry person, you don't mean that they've got some private sort of world of anger inside them that is forcing them to behave in certain ways. You mean they just have all these tendencies to react in certain ways, and if you annoy them a little bit, they start, And so they thought that people such as Gilbert Ryle, though again it's a bit of a caricature to describe him simply as a behaviorist, they thought that when we talk about people's minds, we really talk about their tendencies to react to things. Mm-hmm. But I guess the consensus view that was emerging from the 1950s onwards is that really we're talking about the brain, about brain activity, but in some very schematic sort of way. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about the details of what's happening in the brain. We don't know that, but we're talking about large-scale patterns of activity in the brain, if you like, about there. So when we talk about perceptions, we talk about the brain states that are produced by from the processing of sensory inputs, and that encode a lot of information about our immediate environment, and that can then be used by other brain systems to guide our reactions, to guide behavior, to form beliefs and memories and so on. And so you can think of when we're talking about the mind, we're sort of talking in a very schematic way mm-hmm. about what the brain's doing.
So if you think after Descartes, which other philosophers would you say, post-Descartes, started to change your reading while you were starting to read about this growing up, or from any point in your life when you were reading about this? Would you say it was people like Hume, Berkeley, the new empiricist movement? Because I think that sort of shapes certain empirical views on reality as well.
I certainly liked Hume, though not so much as a philosopher of mind, but I liked his, more than anything, I think I liked his way of approaching philosophical problems, and I liked the way he wrote. But of course, he still had a lot of, I guess, Cartesian assumptions about the idea that, about the mind being a private world which is known better than the rest of reality, and that so he thought that we couldn't really answer this sort of skepticism as to whether there is an external world. But that is something that has captured most philosophers. This idea that we know our own minds better than anything else, and so this is what I was talking before was a sort of long detour, and I was trying to get around to this point that we gradually got this consensus in I suppose from the 1950s, 60s onwards, that mental talk is just about the brain. But still, so you would think, okay, so we've got rid of all that Cartesian stuff. They've got rid of this idea of there being an immaterial soul, got rid of this idea of there being this special private inner world. It's just the brain, and the brain is immensely complex and immense, wonderful piece of biological machinery, if you like. But it's not a separate thing from the rest of the world. It's just a complex part of it. But no, this is the problem. A lot of even people who had thoroughly embraced this view of this brain-centered view of the mind still had, and this is where we come back to Dennett, these Cartesian intuitions about there is still this world of consciousness in there somehow. Now, of course, they'd rejected the view that this depended on an immaterial soul. So they had to say somehow the brain was producing it. Okay, so somehow, and so they had this kind of dualistic picture of the brain now. On the one hand, the brain was doing stuff that we kind of could understand in physical terms. It was processing information, if you like. And we had all these developments in computing theory from the middle of the 20th century, which kind of gave us a sort of handle on that. Yeah, the brain's a sort of like a complex biological computer, sort of. It was a metaphor, and it's not completely accurate, but it gave us a grip on. So that's what the brain is. But then at the same time, there's this other aspect that it seems to be somehow producing this private world of experience, this private inner world that Descartes talked about. So the brain seems to be doing these two things somehow, processing information, which we can kind of understand, and producing this kind of magical inner world. And so then you get, so this kind of worry had been in the background, I think, of materialist theories of mind right through the 60s and 70s and 80s. But then, of course, in the mid-90s, David Chalmers, Australian philosopher of mind, one of the most eminent contemporary philosophers of mind, really woke people up to it and said, look, there are two completely different sort of sets of problems here. There's what he called the easy problems, explaining how the brain does all that information processing, how it processes the signals from the senses and uses the information to regulate behavior and so on. That's there. He called them easy problems, not because they're really easy, but because they're kind of problems we know how to approach. We've got a sort of angle on them. Yeah, because they look like regular scientific problems.
About the easy problem. It's basically talking about neuroscience. Neuroscience science is not easy.
Absolutely, I agree. But it looked easy relative to the other one. And the other one was how the brain, how all this massive billions of interconnected neurons produce this private world of experience. And that looks really, really hard, because it seems to be producing something that just doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, that science has no precedent for, and that moreover is inaccessible to science. Scientists can probe my brain and scan my brain and look and potentially at every neuron firing there. But they're not going to see this in the world. They're not going to detect what it's like to be me, what it's like to be private. Well, that's only for me. So it seems that the brain is producing something that has no precedent elsewhere, that can't be scientifically studied. well, of course, this is meat and drink to philosophers. They say, hey, there's something here that science can't handle. And so we can go for metaphysical speculation. And this is, of course, the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness. And it leads you into metaphysical. The response of many philosophers has been to say, okay, science only tells us about part of reality. There's another part of reality that science can't get a grip on. And let's theorize about it and try and explain this other dimension of reality. Now, really, and there's been some very clever work done in this field. I have no wish to disparage people doing this. I think they're very clever people, and pursuing that project, they're doing, they're pursuing it seriously and with integrity, and they're within that framework, they're doing good work. But really, I think they're not much further on than Descartes in some ways, because all they have are a bunch of intuitions, and then they're trying to make about this inner world, and then they're trying to make the best metaphysical framework for explaining those intuitions. And I mean, one example of this is the movement that is quite popular nowadays and that I've some interest in, which is Panpsychism. And the idea here is, well, this private inner world thing, it seems that brains have it, right? Brains produce it. But why should just brains produce it? After all, it's not a matter of information processing. That's a separate thing. Somehow the brain just has this extra thing, just by being the thing it is. It's not due to it doing certain things, but just being the way it is. So maybe other things have it too. In fact, maybe everything has it. Maybe the complex inner world that we have is the product of the combination of lots and lots of smaller private worlds that the components of our brains have. Maybe every little electron and every elementary particle has a little tiny private world. When you put these together in the right way, you get big private worlds like the ones we've got in our heads. And that's a reasonable inference.
The difficult task for many people, but they are
given the way.
There are also some neuroscientific theories that adopt the panpsychist view. If you take integrated information theory, I mean, they sort of also making the assumption that you can begin with consciousness and move your way upward.
That's the crucial thing. They begin with this picture of the private inner world. They begin with that. Now, if you start there and you say, yes, well, that's real, that's definitely real. In fact, perhaps it's the only thing that I'm really sure of. And then you go down this route. And, okay, have a look down that route, see what's there. Maybe you're on the right track. But maybe, just maybe, those intuitions you started with about the private inner world are not reliable. Maybe seems to us in some sense that there's this private inner world. Maybe that's when we sort of try to think about ourselves and our relation to the wider world, we get this kind of picture of ourselves as being something in here, something smaller than our bodies, as it were, something inside ourselves that is inhabiting some world that is special for us, rather than just being complex organisms that inhabit the public world. Mm-hmm. We get that picture, but maybe that picture is a distortion. Maybe it's a sort of illusion. Now, that's the view that I try to explore.
And so I think
sorry.
let's think about this and summarize this a little. So we know that they started off with this Cartesian split. I mean, we know René Descartes, Cartesian dualism. Once that split occurs, people are now set on a path, trying to figure out these two different realities and how they sort of come together, this mind-body connection in a sense, which is basically what this entire podcast is based on. And what you're saying is at some point you have to realize that a lot of our intuitions, a lot of our perceptions, a lot of our experiences are basically interpretations of certain stimulus, certain stimuli, and we have the tendency to make mistakes and errors due to certain let's say limited resources or poor processing power, etc. Because I think the two most misunderstood views on consciousness currently are panpsychism and illusionism. Illusionism sounds like a very metaphysical theory. It sounds like you're basically telling everyone nothing exists. There is there is no conscious experience. And I think that's exactly where people have this problem and come to you and say, listen, how can you tell me that the one thing that means the most to me does not exist? You're telling me that when I bang my leg onto an object and experience the pain, that's just not existent. That's just non-existent. How can you tell someone that?
I'm not telling people that. And
exactly.
I agree that the use of the word illusion is fraught with risk in that way. Any single word would be. I will stand by it, but maybe we can come on to why I like it. It's better, I think, than having a word like eliminativism or irrealism and just saying these. That's flat. I'm saying there's an illusion, but I'm not saying that that pain doesn't exist. Obviously, I mean, there's some people, some philosophers interpret what I'm saying as saying, look, we don't have any experiences. We don't see, we don't hear, we don't feel. Not saying that. Not saying that. We can just point to occasions when we're having an experience. I stub my toe. There, you're feeling pain. That's real. That's definitely happening. I look at beautiful sunset and the experience of the golden colors and so on. That's real. I'm having a visual experience. I listen to a piece of music. I'm having the auditory experience. That's real. The question is, what is it? Not that it's reality. The reality of this state we call pain is not doubted. Mm-hmm. What I'm doubting is what the nature of pain, the nature of visual experience, of what it is to taste and smell and see. And what I would try and sum it up very, very simply, I would say that the competing pictures are something like this. The sort of Cartesian picture is that stimuli hit my senses, electromagnetic radiation or whatever it is, or chemicals in the air, or pressure waves. They hit my senses and they create a kind of inner world of color and smell and taste and so on. So the colors out there, as we conceive of them, they're not really there. They're created in a private world in my mind, whatever my mind is in this case, which I, as some sort of inner observer, am then aware of in a very certain way. So they create this private world of experience that I interpret. I feel it. Similarly, when I'm in pain, the pain receptors in my toe they send these signals, and that creates the pain somehow in my mind, not in my toe, in my mind. Mm-hmm. That's the view I'm rejecting. I'm saying this idea that it's all created in some private.
Yes, in a sort of inner homunculus. So people tend to think there is some sort of a being, a Cartesian theater, someone's watching all of this happen, which then also then question, because there's an infinite regress. You're going to constantly look for whatever that person's thinking about, whatever the
How do you explain
is thinking about, and so on.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. It's a completely unexplanatory picture, because the problem is, how am I experiencing the world? Well, the story is, there's this little thing in your head that the world is creating another world in your head, a world of private experience, and there's some other little observer in your head that is experiencing that. Okay, we've answered it. No, you haven't, because now you need to explain how the little thing in your head is experiencing the private world. Does it have a little thing in it? It doesn't explain anything. Mm. So the alternative picture is to say that this is what's happening. We're being bombarded with stimuli. We here being the whole organism. Okay, the whole big, sort of clumsy, embodied biological thing that lumbers around. Okay, in my case anyway. And so we're being bombarded with stimuli, and our brains are reacting to it in a massively complex range of ways. Mm-hmm. It's adjusting its own internal states in incredibly complex ways, so that it will be differently poised to react to the next round of stimuli. Mm-hmm. Forming expectations of what's coming next, dispositions to react to what's coming next. It may also be producing overt behavior, but the main effect is internal. Internal in the sense that it's happening in the brain, not in some private one. And that is experience, that massively complex interaction with the world. And our sense that it's happening in a private world is due to the fact that we also have some kind of higher level mechanisms in the brain that monitor what is happening in the brain and react to that. So the brain's reacting to the world, and there are other systems in the brain that are reacting to the reacting. And it's this reacting, it's this reacting to the reacting that creates this sense that we as a whole have that there's a private inner world, makes us say, yes, but there's this world in here. It's all a matter, for me, of reactions, not of presentations in some private world. Experiencing the world is about the world impacting on me and me reacting.
So
even there's a private inner world is a matter of me reacting to that reacting. Yes.
Yeah, and it's important to note. So and they are interacting as well. So it's a continuous loop. It's a feedback loop.
Yes.
No
dynamical.
Just entering and that's it. And then you're sort of producing an experience. You are directly influenced by the real world, because then people will start to have this perception that you're sort of creating an idealist view of everything, sort of. Some people will sort of think that there is some people will think there is some form of dualism here. If you're merely reacting to certain stimulus and not interacting with it, because at that point there is no link between the two.
Absolutely, no, I couldn't agree more. It's an engagement with the world.
Yes.
There's a temptation to think about qualities in the world. The blueness of the sky, the bitterness of the coffee, the pain in my toe. There's a tendency to think that those are sort of qualities that are out there in the world. And in a sense, I think they are, but they're not out there in the way that, as it were, we commonsensically conceive of them. It's not that we know that the blueness is really just a matter of light rays of a certain wavelength being refracted or whatever and hitting my eye. So we think that, so science kind of tells us the blueness isn't out there in that sort of naive way that you thought it was. It's partially created by you. After all, you might be hallucinating the blueness. Or you might be seeing an after image of the blueness. So the blueness is kind of in you. Now, this is where the big mistake happens, I think. People think, okay, so it's not out there, this sort of pure qualitative essence of blue, so it must be in here. It's like there's a sort of blue paint on the world, and if it's not out there, then it must be somehow in here. Well, of course, it's not in here in my brain, so it must be in some other world of mental reality. I don't think the blueness in that sense is there at all. I think the blueness is an interaction between me and the world. But the blueness is me being sensitive to something in the world and reacting to it.
And inherently, when you think about the blueness itself, it's technically the only electromagnetic radiation that's bounced off the object. So that object is actually every other color but blue. So you're completely misinterpreting the object itself by nature.
But what is happening is an interaction, a very complex perceptual interaction with the world. And the language we talk about it, the language of blueness and qualities and so on, that's a way we have of articulating this complex reaction and sharing information about it. I can see something blue. I cannot describe to you the complexity of the interaction because I just don't understand it. I don't know about it. And I don't need to know about it. I just need to recognize it when it's happening. Okay? So I'm in this complex interaction with a certain feature of the world. And I say to you, it's blue, or it's too bitter, or it hurts. And that's enough for the purposes of communication. My brain has given me some kind of access to to the reactions. There's some sort of monitoring, so I can report that this is happening again. I'm in this state again. And we have this cultural, they have this language, this set of concepts for articulating this. And that's fine, that gets us around. The problem then is when we start to ask questions about, yes, but what is that blueness? What is that pain? Okay, there's something definitely real there, this complex interaction, but it isn't some simple, pure essence of blueness. It isn't some simple essence of pain. And if you go chasing that, you're going to be chasing, it's like chasing, I guess perhaps you might, I don't know, this is an analogy I've not really used before, but meanings of words. If you say we use words and words create effects, on each other. We could use words to produce effects. And we can also use them to produce effects on ourselves. We can talk to ourselves. And words we say have meanings, which is a way of encapsulating the kind of effects they have on people. But if you go off chasing, yes, but what is the meaning? And chasing, how did that word get that meaning? And how do those marks on the paper get this meaning? You're trying to turn an abstraction into a concrete thing that you can investigate, or that you need to now expand your sense of reality in order to accommodate this thing. And you don't really if you treat it as something more like an abstraction or indeed an illusion.
So I think we should also then introduce certain concepts to have the discussion a little more coherently. For example, Ned Block differentiating between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, because I think that's precisely where a lot of people might misinterpret this illusion of consciousness, because you're specifically talking about an illusion of phenomenal consciousness and the qualia, the what is it like feeling, Thomas Nagel's infamous what is it like to be a bat. You're talking about that ineffable phenomenal experience that we tend to attribute some sort of an entity or ethereal essence-like substance, either metaphysical or non-physical. And what you're saying with illusionism is rather that that's not the case. We're rather concluding that we're having a certain experience using whatever limited processing power our brains might have.
Yes, we're projecting this image of qualities onto what's happening, whether we're projecting them as, we're not literally projecting, but we're sort of conceptually we're projecting them out there or in here, depending on where we think these things are. But really, it's a framework we have for describing this, what's happening to us. A framework, I think, principally for communication, which we are taking. Some philosophers are taking too seriously. I mean, just to pick up on the access phenomenal distinction, the access consciousness is supposed to be about information. It's the first conception. It's the idea that our senses are continually picking up bits of information about the world around us, which influence our behavior without our really being conscious of it. As we walk down the street, we will adjust the way we walk without really being conscious of it, to avoid things and so on. Or if you're sitting in your chair, you'll move to make yourself more comfortable without being aware that you're doing this. And the idea is that a bit of perceptual information becomes conscious if it's, according to one theory, at one account anyway, if it becomes widely accessible to other brain systems, so that you can remember it, you can think about it, you can report it, you can have emotional reactions, and so that, as it were, the whole system, which is me, has access to it and can use it, and then it's conscious in that sense. Now, the phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be this extra thing that's at least conceptually different from that, and that is this kind of inner glow, this feel that it has, which is something conceptually distinct from all the reactions that the information may be provoked. So the information might have all the same reactions, say you might damage your, hurt your, stub your toe, and it might provoke all these complex reactions, psychological as well as behavioral, and yet you not have any feeling of pain to it. The thought is that's a description of what's called a philosophical zombie. And I'm trying to reject that distinction. I think there just is access consciousness and complex meta levels of access consciousness, access to the access, if you like. Okay? But there's nothing else there. The concept is not picking out anything real other than the concept of phenomenal consciousness, not picking out something real. What a lot of philosophers, among philosophers who buy that distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, there are two strands. One, say, yes, this phenomenal consciousness is something distinct, and it's metaphysically distinct as well. It's something non-physical. Others who say, well, yes, it's distinct, but it's still just part of what the brain's doing. It's still just picking out something. I don't buy the first, and I think the second one is not really. They're trying to have their cake and eat it, really, trying to accept these intuitions that there's something non-physical there, but explain it all. Accept the reality of this thing that seems non-physical while saying that it isn't really non-physical, but it's still real. I don't think you can accept its reality if you want to be a physicalist. Sorry, I rambled a little bit there. But
no worries. It's good. I think you need to express your views because a lot of people misinterpret it quite a bit. When you talk about illusionism as a theory of consciousness, as I said, you're specifically referring to phenomenal consciousness. You're not saying that any experience we're having is an illusion. You're saying that the way we experience these experiences, these phenomenal, what we call phenomenal experiences, are in fact not substantive. So they do not exist as some sort of an essence or entity in the world. But you talk about weak and strong illusionism. Let's briefly cover the difference between the two of them.
All right, that's good. Yes, it picks up on what I was just talking about. I should actually say that this is a quite important thing to say, actually, that illusionism is a term that I've introduced within philosophy of mind. And what I think is illusory is a certain conception of consciousness as certain philosophers conceive of it. I don't think experience consciousness as the person in the street conceives of it is illusory. It's saying that thing you philosophers are talking about is illusory, not that thing. I think the philosophers have taken the thing that we all we're all kind of all familiar with, and imposed a certain way of thinking of that thing upon themselves and upon people who listen to them, and made them think that there's something there isn't, and that doesn't need to be, in order to account for what we're all familiar with. And that's what I'm saying is illusory. It's you philosophers are under an illusion, and the people who've been listening to you. Not that we're at an everyday. When I say that I've got a headache, I'm not under an illusion. I'm under illusion when I impose a philosophical theory of what a headache is.
Yes.
Okay. Having said that, though, there may be and I think there probably is, some biological, psychological basis to this philosophical illusion. I don't think that philosophers are just making this up out of their heads. I think there are certain things about the way we experience, we introspect our own minds, that tempt people to go down that route. So I think this theory that I'm denying is quite natural in some ways, but I'm certainly not denying that we're in.
I think it's almost like talking about, well, if you look at human beings, we've always had this tendency to add some extra layer of existence to us, or some extra added importance to us. If you take the Ian vitalism, we always thought there was something essence-like about that. Then we always thought we were on top of the food chain, and then Darwin obviously comes around and shows us that we're not. We've basically come along with every other species. And there is no top of the food chain. We've all basically made it. Copernicus did the same thing. He took us out of the center of the universe, because we have this tendency to give ourselves something extra. And I think that's precisely where the problem of illusionism comes in. And it almost helps to take us back a little bit and show us that there is, it's almost humble. It makes you a little more humble.
I think so. I do think so. I don't adopt this for ethical reasons, but I think the ethical implications of it, and we can maybe talk about this a bit later, are actually quite benign to my way of thinking. We have this view of ourselves as sealed off within these private mental worlds. So I'm here in my private mental world, and then there's all this stuff that I think is probably out there, but I can't be sure of. All I can be sure of is this little egotistical world there, and you're the same, and everyone else is the same. So we're all really sealed off in these little metaphysical bubbles. No, we are part of the world. We're all part of the same world. There isn't a sort of metaphysical barrier between me and you. If I knew you well enough, and I'd observed you for a long time and got to know you really well and knew how you would react to stimuli in the finest way. So I knew what this would make you think and feel, and what memories and associations this site would call up, and so I think I could gradually get pretty close to knowing what it's like to be you, because I would know, as it were, how you are vibrating in response to the world. This is what experience is. It's you and the world, the world stimulating you and you vibrating in response to it, this dynamic thing. And if I could map that, if I could trace that, follow that out in sufficient detail, I could know what it was like to be you. Now it's easy to think, well, I couldn't, well, because we just don't know other people in that so well. Although I think perhaps if you think of couples who have lived together for a long time, there is often a sense that they've become something like a unit.
Yes.
That their minds are sort of
like when you're thinking about telepathy and you're thinking about someone reading someone's mind. I mean, we all do it to a certain extent every day.
We all do it.
We always know.
Exactly.
So that we always know if someone's upset. You don't really need that many cues to understand if someone else is feeling a certain feeling.
And this idea that you can see somebody suffering and sort of seriously doubt, whether there was a real, pain in the metaphysical sense, then just look at them, for heaven's sake. It's easy to suppose that there's this barrier. I mean, or to know what it's like to be a bat. Well, what is it like to be a bat? Well, let's study bats and study their reactions.
We don't even know what it's like.
What they're sensitive to.
We don't even have to go as far as bats. We don't know really what is it like to be a human. Marvin Minsky talks about it. I think when he's describing computer programs and he's describing artificial intelligence, and he says that it'll be difficult to create artificial intelligence that can recognize its consciousness and that it's conscious. But then again, we rarely do that ourselves. We rarely recognize the fact that we're conscious beings. We don't ever introspect on this thought as often as we think we do.
Absolutely. I think it's Sue Blackmore uses the metaphor of the fridge light, that whenever you open the fridge door, the light comes on. Yes. So you think the light is on all the time. So whenever we ask ourselves, what am I feeling now? We get an answer. And so we think that all the time there's this world of feeling there that is sort of vivid and glowing like the fridge light, and that we only have to sort of direct our attention to it. No, it's more like, I think a lot of the time we're just kind of on autopilot. We're just there in the world, engaging with the world, going around doing our stuff. And whenever we pause for a moment to say, wait a minute, what was that? Did I see that correctly? Then it suddenly seems like we're accessing this private world. But most of the time, we don't feel we're living in our heads. We feel we're living in the world as completely embodied creatures reacting with the world. We're not living in this private mental world is a sort of construction that we come to when we're very, very reflective. I mean, it's no coincidence. How did this all start? Not with Descartes sort of out, fencing or whatever. He was a fencer, wasn't he? It was when he withdrew himself into his, was it his kitchen set by his stove, wrapped himself up in his cloak, excluded the world and started doing pure thought. Well, yes, maybe you do get into that sort of, you do conceive of the mind-body problem in that way when you do that. But when your mind is actively engaged with the world, when it's guiding you in fencing or whatever you might be doing, then it doesn't feel so distinct.
But even when somebody does exclude everything from an external perceptive experience, for example, your visual system, your auditory system, olfactory, you exclude all of that. Merely sitting down in a blanket, trying to exclude everything, it's impossible to exclude nociception, pain reception, chemoreception, every other internal receptor that's still functioning, no matter what you're doing, whether you're meditating, whether you're exercising. These are all still running at every point at all times. So we're still formulating judgments and conclusions based on that prior information. Yeah,
you're still buzzing in reaction to your own body. I mean, it's this. If there's one thing I'd like to do, at least, to get people to sort of give up this static picture of consciousness as something being presented. I mean, this is again, Dennett has talked about the Cartesian theory, things being presented to consciousness. It's the senses process the sensory inputs, and they sort of put it all together and create a kind of multimodal presentation to consciousness. And Dan says, and then what happens when this has been presented to consciousness? What happens then? Consciousness, whatever that is, the self or whatever is observing, has to react. And now suppose you could produce all those reactions without the presentation. You just sort of cut from the incoming processing to the reactions, and you cut out the presentation. How does that make, what have you lost? You've not lost anything. Everything's in the reaction. actions, on the impact that the world is making upon you.
I must say, with Daniel Dennett's views, when I first was trying to figure out consciousness myself, when I was trying to dive in deep, try and figure out what is consciousness, because we all have these questions. Growing up, I grew up in South Africa, Indian parents, a lot of links with Hinduism, Buddhism, a lot of the views. So there's always this spiritual side of it, but I didn't grow up very religious. So I always had this scientific / philosophical view of the world. So I started to figure out try to understand what is consciousness, what is this reality. And for the longest time, I think probably till I was about 24 or so, I had the emergentism view. So I figured that you work your way up. You start from physics, go up to chemistry, biology, physiology, then somehow psychology will appear. And it's just something that happens. The more complex the levels become, the more you could have this phenomena. For example, if you take multiple streets and houses, it somehow becomes a city. There's no real clear distinction as to how it becomes that city, but at that point, it eventually is. If you take enough houses, enough people, enough whatever. But the more I read into it, the more I read Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, moving up, and then reading about it and realizing more about our perceptions, our experiences, how much we actually don't know regarding our own introspective experiences. The illusory. So a lot of these illusions, if you look at blindsight, attention blindness, if you look at things that illusionists and experts in the sleight of hand, I'm talking about in this case, do to trick our perceptual limitations, it really exposes the irony behind this naive realism we have towards reality. We assume we know exactly what's going on around us at all times, and therefore it's easy to conclude we know what's going on inside as well. And
illusionism really is, if you like, just implying that insight that is quite widely shared about perception. The perception is sort of selective and to some extent distorting and caricaturing. It's providing us with the information about the world that we need. Not telling us everything that's happening, it's telling us what we need to know. It's really just applying that insight to introspection itself, to when we look inwards and see what's happening inside our, well, I was going to say, do we say mind or brain? I don't mean minds in the private sense. I mean, when we look what's happening inside us, inside our brains. Again, it gives us a schematic idea. You're in that state again. Which one? You don't need to know in detail. It's that one that's a bit like that other one, and that has that kind of range of effects on you, and so on. So it's introspection too is presenting a selective, distorted, caricatured view of what's happening inside us, which is all we need.
I think Dennett describes it as it is an illusion of the brain, for the brain, by the brain.
Yes, yes, and I like that. But let me just say something about emergentism there, because a lot of people like this idea of emergentism, and I think there's a way of thinking about emergence which is perfectly okay and fine, and there's a way of thinking about it which I think is quite suspect. And the idea that as you put components together in more and more complex ways, you get more and more complex structures with more that can do more interesting things. That's perfectly true. Build a computer. As you put the things together, you can do more stuff. That's fine, as you say, as you assemble buildings and civic structures and so on, and roads, and eventually you get a city. And there's nothing mysterious about that. We can understand how it happens. We maybe can't draw a hard line and say now it's a city when previously it wasn't. But it's just all there is to being a city is having enough of these sort of civic structures put together in the right sort of way, and it's intelligible. There's no mystery about it. How did it become a city? It wasn't that something extra happened to make it into a city. The trouble with thinking about the dodgy sense of emergence is the idea that when you get to a certain level of complexity, kind of new things pop into existence, that completely new features or new powers, new causal powers pop into existence that are not explainable in terms of the components. So it'd be as if you put together a computer and it could do all the regular things of the computer, but suddenly it got some extra power that you'd not predicted, and you can't explain, suddenly it can levitate or something. There's no explanation for this, just that when you put enough computer parts together, the thing floats, and nobody has any idea why. Or that when you get a city of a certain size, maybe it suddenly starts, I don't know, it starts glowing or something, inexplicably. And all you can say is, when you put things together in a complex enough way, that happens, but we no idea why. And that's very different from the other sort of illusion, which is that when you organize things in complex structures, you get, they can do more and more complex things, but it's understandable how that happens. Okay, you couldn't possibly design something to emerge in the second sense, because you can't predict it would happen. You just got to copy cases where it has happened. And the trouble with that sort of emergence is that it gives a sort of license to people to hang on to their belief in things, even though they can't explain them. So you say there's this extra ingredient, ingredient to consciousness that can't be explained in brain terms. No, it just emerges.
Yeah, I think. Do you think that type of thinking stems from the fact that quantum physics has suddenly shifted the way people think? Because I was talking to Michael about this, Graziano. We were discussing how much he dislikes the fact that the fact that we have no understanding of quantum mechanics and cannot explain how suddenly this becomes physical reality, that must have something to do with consciousness as well, because it's the only other thing that we know and just cannot explain, and he does not like to talk about it. Do you think that that's exactly where this emergentism view, the strong version of emergentism, kind of stems from? The fact that reality has been shifted since Einstein and a lot of the guys with quantum mechanics have changed reality for us.
It gives support to people who want to say, look, just something fundamentally new happens in brains when you get them to a certain level of complexity, something fundamentally new that we couldn't have predicted from the components, or we can't explain in terms of the components, occurs. You could have said the same thing about life. You could have said when you put biological components together in a certain way, at a certain point it becomes alive. And that becoming alive is something extra to it having all the components, the heart and the lungs and everything, and the skeleton and so on, all organized together. It suddenly acquires this extra function of life, extra feature of life, which gives it new powers. Now,
and even if you look at life itself, we also have such blurry lines when we talk about life. What do we really consider to be life in the first place?
But if you want to be an emergentist,
be a fetus. At what point are we going to conclude? And that takes it into a very dark topic.
Well, if you're an emergentist, you're going to have to say that, there is some point, I guess, at which this emerges, and where it didn't have it before, and then suddenly it emerged. And that, of course, is a problem with consciousness. Where does that emerge, both developmentally and across species? Which species has it emerged in? Has it emerged? We can look at the brain systems that a certain creature has, say an octopus. Do those brain systems cause consciousness to emerge? How do we know? We're not octopi. Octopi. Anyway, to come back to the quantum physics, I think people who want to take that view, they can, say, well, and I suppose I say, well, look, that's just, you're just introducing mystery there into how this happens. It just sort of jumps from one state into another with no prior physical explanation, and that's, and they say, but that's what's happening in physics. The physics, surely you accept that physics is a hard science. It's the hardest of them all. It's fundamental. And they're talking about weird stuff like this. So why can't we have weird stuff like this in neuroscience and so on? I can see that it's rhetorically it's a useful device, but I don't think there's any evidence at all that those processes actually that quantum processes have anything to do with consciousness, although some people think they do, or that consciousness is in some way analogous to them. I don't think they're at different ends of the spectrum, levels of complexity. Okay. I don't think that look, the brain, here's a nice one a nice example that Dennett uses. The brain is made of, how many billion neurons?
80 billion. 86, I think about 86 billion.
86 billion. Okay. Yeah. Now each of those is just, a little cell. It's not, not that much different from a yeast cell. So in a bowl of yeast, there's about 86 billion yeast cells. There's not, the difference is in how they're connected up, how they're interacting with each other. And that's the place to look in that massive complexity, massive connective complexity. That's the place to look for what separates the brain from the yeast cells, not in some sort of magical, metaphysical extra that's somehow compatible to the things that happen at the basic level of physics. We're dealing with complex, evolved biological structures here, not with the basic physical components of the universe. And it's natural to think that everywhere we look in biology, there's immense complexity, and it's evolved complexity. It's been selected for its effects. Why think that it's any different with the mind, with consciousness? It's
and
just
also
another very complex, evolved feature.
You're also introduced to a problem of trying to then attribute consciousness to other beings, because now we have to look at certain beings and try to determine, is this being conscious? Is this one not? Michael and I were discussing, it was just about 3 days ago, we were talking about how trying to attribute consciousness to people also is very problematic, especially when you take into account psychiatric patients and certain psychiatric conditions. When you look at someone who's highly dosed on certain antipsychotics and the way they look less conscious, and it's easy to make an attribution that that person is less conscious than you are, to show just how much it functions kind of like a spectrum, how much we determine how conscious we really are. And I know, as you mentioned, Susan Blackmore, the more we conclude that we're having these phenomenal experiences, the more you're likely to then get stuck in a fixed false belief. And that's how she introduces delusionism, because then at that point, you're forced to then constantly conclude that you're having these experiences. So just while we're on that, let's talk about some of the people who do support illusionism as a theory of consciousness, because it's backed by many.
Sorry, I'm conscious that I didn't answer your question about weak and strong illusionism.
Oh, yes.
Shall I just do that before we go? Because I somehow took a long detour. So let me just answer that question, and then you come back with the one that you're at, the illusionist there. Weak and strong illusionism. It goes something like this. People make this distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness in the sense of information processing, and then phenomenal consciousness in the sense of this feel that the experience seems to have from the inside. And now, if you're a non-physicalist, you're going to say, well, this phenomenal consciousness, it's kind of some extra property of the brain in addition to its physical ones. But a lot of people don't want to say that. They want to say, no, we're physicalists. But still, we don't want to deny that phenomenal consciousness is real. There really is this kind of, they still hold on to a lot of these Cartesian intuitions, but they want to combine it with physicalism. So they say, look, this thing you're talking about, phenomenal consciousness, this world of mental qualities, it's real but physical. Now, that means they've got to say that we're not quite right about it. Because, for instance, some of the things that people want to say about phenomenal consciousness are that it's completely private, that it's absolutely inaccessible to anybody else. Now, if it's just a physical state, then that can't be true, because physical states are not private in that way. They're accessible to neuroscience. So if you want to say that phenomenal consciousness is real but physical, you're going to have to say that it's an illusion to think that it's really radically private in that way. Similarly, you're going to have to say probably that it's an illusion to say that it's completely ineffable, that it can't be described. If it's a physical state, then you can give a physical description of it. So they're going to have to say that's an illusion too. And of course, they're going to say that it's an illusion to think that it's something non-physical that could exist without that you could have a physical copy of the brain that didn't have this property, because it is just a physical property. So they're going to have to say, people who want to be realists about phenomenal consciousness, but physicalists, are going to have to say that we're quite wrong about phenomenal consciousness in various ways. So they're going to have to say that those features of phenomenal consciousness are illusory. So phenomenal consciousness is real, but it's an illusion to think that it's non-physical, that it's ineffable, that it's really private and so on. But it's still real, they say. Now, I call that weak illusionism, because it's still accepting that phenomenal consciousness is real, that these qualia, of course, I don't think we use the word qualia. Qualia is the name for these feels, what its likeness is, that they're real, but it's an illusion to think they have these strange properties.
So the weak illusionist, so the weak version of illusionism is, in other words, not quining qualia.
It's not quining qualia. It's saying qualia are real, but they don't have these weird properties. Now, my objection to that, in fact, from my own personal history on this, the way I came to illusionism was by just saying, I just can't make sense of this then. If these things don't have any of those properties, what are they? What's left when you take away all of those, supposedly, all of those problematic properties, when you say they're not private, they're not. So this is where you're dismantling the whole Cartesian picture, but you're saying, but there's still something there. What? If all that's left there is whatever brain processes are causing me to think that I have qualia, if that's all that's left of the notion of qualia, that there's something causing me to think I've got it, I have them. Sorry, I'm getting a bit. All that's left is the notion of some brain processes that cause me to think that I've got phenomenal consciousness. Then that's not really phenomenal consciousness at all. If it's something more than that, what is it? What is this field once it's been stripped of all these problematic properties? So I thought, you can't really, being a weak illusionist is a sort of cop-out. It's saying, yeah, I want to be a physicalist, I want to take the scientific perspective on this, but I've still got these intuitions and still there's something, and don't like it. Now, the strong illusionist sort of bites the bullet and says, no, the whole thing's illusory.
And then at that point, we'll now call phenomenal experiences quasi-phenomenal experiences or pseudo-phenomenal experiences. What
I mean by that is simply whatever it is that's causing me to. Yes. I mean, I'm certainly have this impression, if you like, in some sense of there being phenomenal projects. I'm inclined to say that I think that I have them. Even I, kind of get myself in the frame of mind where I think, yeah, there is this inner world. Now, there's something that's causing me to think that. There's something's happening in my brain explains why I'm tempted to think that. That needs explaining. So there's I call them zero qualia, quasi-phenomenal properties, whatever it is that causally explains my sense that I have phenomenal properties. But that's just some very complex feature of my brain. It's not, that's something that can be explained in regular sort of information processing terms, I suppose. It's not capturing anything genuinely qualitative and feely and so on. So I think the idea is that my sense is that the weak position, which has been the orthodox one among many philosophers of mind, really just can't do it. And you've got to either go full out and be some sort of dualist and accept that there really is something extra here, some extra metaphysical, or be an illusionist. So illusionist is really sort of consistent physicalism, I think.
So illusionism, in the sense, is more like an epistemological illusion rather than an ontological illusion.
It's the illusion that something exists that doesn't exist.
So technically it would then be also an ontological illusion that is explained epistemologically as something real.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes. It's the illusion that something exists that doesn't exist. Yeah. So in that sense, it's an ontological illusion. Yeah. But it's created. Yes, I think yes.
Okay. So when
the question you were starting on.
Yeah. So let's think about some of the supporters of illusionism, because I know Daniel Dennett's one of them, and primarily when I was going on this journey trying to figure out consciousness, he was the one that started to get me to think about it very differently. It was one of my turning points. But another thing that really got me to start thinking about illusionism that had nothing to do with my reading was more interacting with patients in clinical encounters. When you start to see how certain aspects of their reality can shift and change based on certain neurological deficits, certain psychiatric deficits, it's very easy to then see how we can manipulate our reality and our conclusions based on reality. So, for example, someone who has hemispatial neglect, someone who has a stroke, someone who has any sort of neurological fallout can make very strong and false claims regarding or confabulations regarding their experiences. So that's what fascinated me most. And as I read on, I stumbled across your theory of illusionism. And I felt like it describes exactly what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. Not phenomenally, of course, but quasi-phenomenally.
In an everyday sense feeling. I'm not happy with the everyday.
And really, I feel for those who believe that you are sort of attacking their right to existence. I mean, I think that anybody who's claiming that you're doing that has not read the work enough and just does not understand it. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the supporters. I mean, you were the editor for Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness, and in that book, you have people like Susan Blackmore, Nicholas Humphrey, Daniel Dennett, Michael Graziano, Pierre Boom, all these people defending this theory. Joshua Bach's one of those people who also defend the theory. A lot of highly intellectual thinkers with some really great theories of consciousness all seem to also draw the same conclusion. Let's talk about some of that.
First of all, let me just say something about what you said about the clinical case. I think this is really, really interesting. And this is a thing that's central to Dennett's approach to this. What's really interesting is to look at cases where our sense of this Cartesian inner world breaks down.
Yeah, so there's a lot of them. If you take, let's take, for example, if someone has a split brain. I was talking about this just the other day. If you cut the corpus callosum and have a corpus callosectomy, you split the brain into two. And at that point, Michael Gazzaniga describes this now as the brain having two illusions, two different. So the brain is almost constructing multiple illusions of experience. Because if the left hemisphere is telling you to do something to the right side, and the right hemisphere is telling your left side of your body to do something, they can both disagree. So at that point, it's clear that you can almost have two. There is no unitary consciousness. So that entire conclusion that we draw, this attribution that there is one unitary space, is already a mistake. So I think that's one clinical encounter.
Absolutely, and I really hope that this line of investigation can be pursued, because I think it's the best way, perhaps, of empirically testing this approach. To see what light it sheds on these cases. Let's go back to Dennett. You asked about I coined the term illusionism, but Dennett has been writing about this for far longer than I have, all his career really, and he has used the notion of illusion frequently. I mean, I borrowed the notion from him, and he is the one who has the claim to be the author and
hopefully
preeminent defender.
I spoke to Dennett. He said hopefully he will be chatting to me soon, so hopefully we'll get his views in too.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I'm reluctant to try to summarize his approach in a few words, but I think one thing that he would want to say is that the brain isn't producing a single account of experience. We tend to think that there is this inner world where there's of experience, where there's a sort of a presentation of experience for the self that is unified and coherent, and everything's there in it. It's all put together, the sounds and the shapes and the colors, and there's one version of it, and that's what we're experiencing. It unfolds in time, and that's our private mental world. Now, one thing that Dennett wants to say is that that's an illusion, because we know that the brain doesn't work like that. The brain has multiple different systems for sensory processing and for producing reactions, control systems for producing reactions to sensory processing. And these don't all sort of channel through some central region where everything is assembled and then parceled out again. Why would the brain need to do that? The brain is the sort of the headquarters where that happens. It doesn't need to have a headquarters within the headquarters. As soon as Dennett says, as soon as a discrimination has been made by one sensory system, it can be put to use. You can start reacting. No point waiting until all the other sensory discriminations have been made. I mean, that would be, from a survival point of view, that would be pretty disastrous. If you've noticed, something large and solid flying towards your head, if your brain system has detected that, duck. Don't wait until you've got auditory confirmation of it or something as well. So that's not how it works.
I think a nice way to describe Dennett's views is to also look at the user illusion and what Dennett...
Yes.
Yeah.
So the point is, what's happening in the brain is there's multiple drafts, as he says, multiple drafts of experience being constructed all the time and put to use, and many of them just dying away, others leaving some impact on memory and so on, others not, and so on. So the question then is not, where is this headquarters? How is this this unified account of experience constructed. It's why do we think that one is constructed? And then its answer to that is broadly that it's a story we tell ourselves, because whenever we ask ourselves, well, hang on, what's happening? What am I experiencing? Whenever we sort of move up a level from just reacting to the world to sort of reacting to our own reacting and saying, hang on, what am I doing now? What's happening to me now? We get an answer. One of these streams of experience gets control of the, if you like, of the, initially, socially, for it gets control of the vocal system. Someone says to me, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? One of these streams of experience gets control of the vocal system. We say, oh, I noticed that look at that, it's on fire or something, or there's something moving out there, or I've got this pain. Maybe you hadn't been thinking about the pain, but somebody's asked you, so they think, oh, it's pain. Yes, it's still there. And
I think
you great tell somebody a story.
Another way to bring that into the clinical encounter is with Gersaniger's work. When the person's right hand basically hits it out of the left hand, they always confabulate a reason for why they did this. So they always come up with a reason that was not genuinely the reason. We tend to draw an incorrect conclusion. So that's just.
And of course, the two sides of the brain come up with different stories. They're trying to make sense. They're trying to tell a story, because I think that I think Dennett would agree with this, that a lot of this is a fairly late evolutionary development, and that it's to do with it occurs in a social context. We need to explain. We want to share information. We want to share experience. It's an incredibly useful thing. Don't drink that; it tastes horrible. That's useful to know. Somebody may not have noticed you spitting it out, but you can tell them later. Don't drink it, because you have some understanding of how the world impacts on you. The world is impacting on us. It means things. Things around us mean things to us. They mean things to us because they have an effect on us. If we can register that effect and report it to others, that's incredibly useful. Also, it might be useful sometimes to conceal how things impact on you, if they're particularly nice ones and you want to keep them to yourself. And then, of course, so we have this way of constructing a story, and we get into the habit of continually, as Dennett puts it, probing ourselves, asking what's happening now, what's this? And whenever we do, we get an answer, like the fridge light. Whenever we open the door, the light comes on. There's something there for us to tell. And we think that we get this sense then that what we're doing is accessing a pre-existing internal reality that was there just waiting for us to attend to it. No, it's just constructed on the fly as we need it. And the thing that really reinforces this is that we do it to ourselves as well. We don't just do it for the sake of other people. We're continually noticing what's happening to us, and maybe not explicitly talking to ourselves in inner speech, but we're continually noticing what our state is. And this is the basis of this sense of a private inner world.
Dennett also talks about the user illusion. So you're looking at a computer, you're clicking on all these files. It's easy to click on the recycling bin, but there is no recycling bin. These are merely digits. These are ones and zeros. Someone's designed this machine that creates this experience that you're experiencing. That's completely illusory. This recycling bin does not exist in reality. That's right.
But there is something there that does exist and that's very useful. And that the icon gives you access to something very, very useful. It allows a certain sort of self-manipulation, manipulation of the computer, or in the case of introspection, self-manipulation. That's very useful. That's real. That's the analog for pain. What's real there is the actual operation of deleting a file. It's just the little icon of it that is illusory. And one thing, when you say that to people, though, of course, they say, well, hang on then. So there must be a private inner world for the illusion of the desktop. Where's the illusion happening? That's not the way to think of it. The illusion is for you as a whole. It's a matter of the organism as a whole reacting to itself. Okay, certain things you can do to yourself by way of talking to yourself, reminding yourself, stimulating yourself by imagining things and so on. This doesn't involve a private homunculus. It involves you, the whole organism, reacting to yourself as a whole organism.
Yeah, I think at that point, it would be great to also touch on what I call the illusion delusions, because there are several counter-arguments, some better than others, some far worse. So the most common one, I would say, is if it is an illusion, who's experiencing the illusion? It's probably the one I've seen the most commonly being asked to you, Dennett, and anyone who claims it.
And it's easy to see the objection. But the thing is, what you need to realize is the objection turns on the very Cartesian picture that I'm trying to deny. So the idea is this: let's start with a perceptual illusion. Okay, not an introspective illusion, out of conscious, but a perceptual illusion. And the common way of thinking about this is, look, there isn't really let's say, I don't know, a pink rat sitting on the shelf there, but there's a sort of image of a pink rat being displayed in my private mental world. Okay, and for the little homunculus in there to observe. Okay, and that's what an illusion is. It's when the thing isn't really out there, but there is a mental version of it in here, a private mental version of it in here. That's how people think of perceptual illusions. Now I come along and say, oh, well, actually, this private mental world is itself an illusion, an introspective illusion. So they think, okay, so on the same model, I'm saying this Cartesian world is illusory. Okay, so that must mean that it's not really there, but it's there in some other mental world. Just as this the thing that wasn't there in reality was here in this mental world. If this mental world is an illusion, then it must be present in another mental world. And so I've just kind of refuted myself, because if the first one isn't there, then there must be a second one, and so on and so forth. But the point is, I don't accept that account of illusion in the perceptual case. I don't think that hallucinating a pink rat involves there being a mental image of a pink rat in here. I think it means to be under the illusion that there's a pink rat there is for me to be reacting as if there were, in a whole hugely complex range of ways, depending on the emotional reactions I would have to a pink rat, to having the expectations of what the rat will do next, to having all the whole range of calling up associations that I have with rats, being disposed to move in a certain way, and so on. All this massively complex range of reactions that the sight of a pink rat would present to me, would create in me. And similarly, having the illusion of having a mental world involves me having all these sort of higher level reactions appropriate to that would be appropriate if there were this private mental world. So it involves, for instance, being disposed to say, look, and there's this private mental world in here. That's one of the reactions that a mental world would create. So it's, to me, to be under the illusion of something is for the organism to be experienced, to be having all the reactions that would be appropriate if the thing were real.
Yes. And
so to be a perceptual illusion is to have all the reactions that would be appropriate if the thing were there. To have the illusion of a private mental world is to have all the be undergoing all the reactions that would be appropriate if there were a private mental world. There's no circularity in that.
Yeah, no, I think
it's not, doesn't involve an inner homunculus. The thing that's having the reactions is me.
Yes.
The whole organism.
It also presupposes that there has to be some sort of a self, or
yes,
completely excludes the fact that your biological system is the one experiencing. That is the person in a sense, or the self in a sense.
If you like, think about it as, yes, exactly. Think about it as we were just talking about with Dennett, the idea of this creation of a narrative. For something to seem real to you is for it to get into that narrative. So for the pink rat to seem real is for it to get into my narrative of what's happening.
And even those narratives tend to change. For example, I mean, you read my paper when we talk about schizophrenia, and someone who can also conclude that their narrative slowly changes. I mean, as they start getting different signals from reality, they start having what's known as psychosis. They start getting out of touch with reality, and they start to conclude that they have less consciousness, or they have less of an essence within them, and everything's almost exterior, passivity phenomena where everything's kind of controlling you.
Well, think about this. If you're getting distorted perceptual inputs of for some reason, now, you're still wanting to try and make sense of it. You're still wanting to do this thing of create a narrative. You're still wanting to explain yourself to other people and to yourself. So you're trying now desperately, but now all the elements that you just like, I don't know, imagine like a newsroom that's getting all these conflicting reports, and some exaggerated reports that something terrible has happened, and other reports saying everything's fine. And then you're showing these strange images that there's a huge explosion, but yet it's all peaceful, and all these things. Now you're the news editor trying to make sense of this, and you're what do you do? Maybe you construct some kind of weird narrative, say that the world is all disturbed, or somebody's manipulating the world in some strange way and changing things in the way that they shouldn't be changing. Or maybe you're being persecuted and they're deliberately sending you false reports to confuse you. You're trying to make sense of this by constructing another narrative that makes sense of the apparent narrative that the world is supplying you with. And it's not surprising people get, I think there's, these are people's attempts to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense to them, yes, and make sense of themselves as experiencers of this world. And I think perhaps one thing that makes this particularly difficult, I'm just sort of speculating here, is that we're very skilled at doing this most of the time when things are going normally. We don't notice we're creating this narrative, as it were. It just seems, as I said, as if we just sort of look inwards and there's this world of experience and it's all stable and all going along nicely and we're fine. And you don't introspect and suddenly find massive changes, unexpected changes in that inner world. And so we're not prepared to deal with distortions to it. We don't realize that we're constructing a narrative, so we don't know how to deal with things that are distorting the narrative.
No, certainly.
And it seems to us, of course, very, very real. And what's even worse is that this is, as we know from the Cartesian tradition, that this is like the essence of us. This is the real world. This is the core of our being, and it's being all disturbed. And this is what we're supposed to be most comfortable with, where we really live and where our real being is, and it's being torn apart. No wonder people feel.
Yeah, it's easy to understand why someone would say that. But I think, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, let's try and look at some other counter arguments. Would you describe it? Would you think of it as a sort of property dualism?
No. My view.
Yeah.
No. The property dualism is the idea that there are extra properties in the world over and above those that, let's say, that can be categorized by the physical sciences, by the third-person sciences. It's the idea that it's very like Descartes' view. Descartes' view was a form of substance dualism. He said that there is this private mental world, and it's actually a separate thing. It's a separate thing to the physical, it's a separate substance. Property dualism says, well, there is this sort of private mental world, but it's not a separate thing, but it's a separate aspect of the brain that is completely invisible to brain science. Okay, so it's a non-physical property of the brain rather than a non-physical thing associated with the brain. And my whole thrust of what I'm doing is no. No, we don't need to posit that. That's taking these Cartesian intuitions seriously. It's like saying that, I don't know, I guess it's like saying that, you've read the Sherlock Holmes stories and they're really convincing, so where's Sherlock Holmes? Is he a separate thing, or is he maybe was maybe Sherlock Holmes some sort of alter ego of Conan Doyle, and there was this ghostly thing following him around? It's a fictional construction. So no, it's definitely not anything like property dualism. And
also let's talk about the eliminative materialism and how it's different from that as well.
Right. Well, this is a little bit tricky because as it was originally formulated by Paul Churchill and Patricia Churchill, eliminative materialism is really a theory about what's called folk psychology, about our everyday framework for explaining and predicting other people's behavior in terms of their mental states, in terms of what they think and want and the decisions they make, and so on. And so we say, why is he crawling around on the floor? Well, he thinks he's dropped his contact lens, and of course he wants to find it. Now, the point of the eliminative materialist argument is, well, that's just like a very sort of crude folk theory. It's like the idea that things fall because they want to get to the center of the earth or something like that. It's fire goes up because it wants to join the stars or something. It's not a scientifically based theory, and it may be sort of works in some limited cases, but it doesn't tell you very much. It's not, you can't integrate it with science, and it's really just a bit of folklore. It's not so much different from talking about people. Why is that person distressed? Oh, they're possessed by a demon. It's in that sort of level. And so we should just eliminate it. And also, since we're materialists, we should look to science, and brain science in particular, to provide us with a better framework for understanding predicting people's behavior. Now, the thing to note there is that's mainly not concerned, that's not specifically concerned with consciousness. It's concerned with the whole vocabulary of explaining people's behavior in terms of their mental states. So one way in which illusionism is different is it focuses specifically on consciousness. And I'm not sure if the Churchlands really are, sure they are completely, I think they're not very hostile to it, but my sense is that they don't want to deny phenomenal consciousness so much as say that it is actually just a brain process, that it's real but is just a brain process. So they'd be reductionists about it rather than illusionists about it. But I mean, that's for them to explain it. So first of all, it's more specific. It's about, I mean, I'm not an eliminative materialist about folk psychology generally. I think that it does a useful job. No, that's another topic.
Because that's precisely why I brought it up, is because I think that a lot of people tend to think that if you are an illusionist, you most likely are an eliminativist, which is not the case.
No, all I want to eliminate is a certain philosophical conception of consciousness that I think is doing a lot of harm in, well, yeah, I don't want to be too hostile, but I think it is, I think it's causing, I think it's directing a lot of attention onto questions that aren't really fruitful and away from questions that would be a lot more fruitful. So I want to eliminate a certain philosophical conception of consciousness.
Probably could be, one of those questions probably could be the search for neural correlates of consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's a wild goose chase. Because what people are searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, they're trying to do this. They say, look, there is this phenomenal consciousness, okay? And it's somehow produced by the brain. Maybe we can't understand it in terms of what the brain's doing, but somehow the brain's producing it. Now, since we can't explain it, maybe it just emerges. You know, you get a certain complex enough kind of neural activity, and then the lights come on, bingo, the inner light comes on and you're conscious. Now, we can't really explain that in terms of what's happening in the brain, but we could at least find the bits of the brain that correlate with it, the bits of the brain that have to be active in order for it to come on. Okay, so they're looking to find these correlates, which patterns of brain activity cause it to come on. And I think that's a mistake, first of all, because I don't think there is anything to come on. I think that's a story we tell ourselves, kind of an illusion, and it doesn't exist, so it doesn't have any neural correlates. What we could look for, the neural mechanisms that explain why we think it comes on. Why do we think it happens? What's the explanation for the illusion? But that isn't looking for correlates, it's looking for explanations, it's looking for mechanisms. And the other reason why I think this is a wild goose chase is that even if it were real, we would never be able to actually find the correlates, because it's, by hypothesis, supposed to be radically private. So you can never actually, make a scientist, the community of scientists can never actually detect it and correlate it with the things they're seeing on their scans, because it only exists in the mind of the subject themselves. And I don't think even the subject themselves could correlate it with brain readings, because they still have to react psychologically in order to do the correlation. They have to say to themselves, oh, I'm currently in that state. Let's see which brain state it correlates with on these readings here from the scanner. And that's itself a psychological reaction. They can never, if it's purely private in that way, I don't think you ever could find the correlates of it.
Yeah, no, precisely.
So I think that's a wild goose chase.
Yeah, and so in essence, let's think about with regards to some of these arguments against illusionism. It's always going to come back to phenomenal consciousness. I feel that's where most people are going to always bring it back to. I think another example would be to talk about Mary the neuroscientist. And that's another argument people often bring to you. What I want to do with this podcast is obviously give anyone who's on the show an opportunity to express themselves and just clear the air for whatever type of counter argument somebody has for them. So with regards to Mary the neuroscientist, she basically knows everything there is to know about perception, vision, and neuroscience in general. And suddenly, but she's living in a black and white house. So she's never perceived color for all her life. And suddenly she's able to leave this house and see color for the first time. Now, the question is if Mary did have all the knowledge there is to know about visual perception, color experience, when she leaves the house, is she going to experience something new? Because that's what they tend to think and coin as phenomenal consciousness.
Well, look, she's certainly going to have experiences she hadn't had before. No one denies that. She's not had color experiences before. Now she's going to have some. Okay, so that will be an interesting thing. She'll be in a state that she'd not been in before. The question is whether that will reveal some new information to her that she hadn't got from studying the mechanisms of color vision. When she has a color experience, she'll say, "Oh wow, I'm having color experience. This is great. I've not had these before. I knew all about them, of course." It's like somebody who say somebody who studied a city, say Paris, say in intimate detail, and they've been through it all on Google Earth, say, and they've studied the history and they've studied every little street, and then you take them to Paris. Would they learn anything new about Paris? Well, they would say, "Wow, I'm in Paris. This is amazing. I've never been here before." I knew all about it, of course. I'm not surprised by anything I see here. I knew that street's there. So now if my view is right, Mary would be in the position of the person who'd done the intimate, sort of centimeter by centimeter study of Paris. Okay, mm-hmm. So imagine somebody, while she's been in her room, she's not been in Paris, she has studied every centimeter of Paris in the most, minutest detail. And now you take her to Paris. Will she learn anything new about Paris? No, because,
she already knows
she'd studied it. Yeah. But she'll still probably be really, amazed and think, "Wow, Paris, I'm actually here." Mm-hmm. So that's the analogy. And also, of course, there's another difference as well. And I think this is what tricks people a little bit. When she'd be doing this centimeter by centimeter study of Paris, she'd been looking, the patterns on the walls. She could tell you the pattern of decay and damp or whatever on the walls, and where the plaster had flaked on this wall, on that street, on the so and so. So she knows everything. You've got to remember, she knows where every little bit of grit on the street is. If she bends down and stares at the floor, she will tell you whether there's a scuff mark from somebody's footprint or something on the floor. She knows everything. This is why it's really hard to imagine. Now, still, when she goes to Paris, she won't learn anything new about Paris, but that information that she already knew will be presented to her in a new way. Okay, so instead of this centimeter by centimeter equations, it will suddenly all be just presented to her around like that. And she might go, "Wow, putting it all together like that is fascinating." It's not that I didn't know that all that was there, but now it's all being presented to me in a new way. And I can just turn my head and it's all just there. Wow, previously I had to sort of look it up laboriously. And now it's just all available to me. Wow, that's neat. But it's not telling me anything I didn't know. And I think that's the sort of analogy.
Do you think that the view of illusionism gets a lot of hate because of the fact that you've used the word illusionism or illusion? I mean, just with some context, a lot of people, because the word illusion originated in Latin. In Middle English, it was translated to mean deceiving or deception. Illudere was the original word. So I think there's obviously going to be this backtracking that has to always occur. And I think that's why Michael calls it a caricature. And I know Nicholas Humphrey refers to it as something else. But I want to ask you about, before we get to the fact that this word, the choice of the word might affect it, what are your thoughts on Nicholas Humphrey's change in direction regarding illusionism? Because I've read his papers and there's a clear shift in his thinking. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm honestly not. I want to talk to Nick some more. I'm not sure there has been a shift. There's certainly a shift in the way he expresses the theory. And I don't think the theory itself has shifted. I don't think the theory going back to seeing red and soul dust and the work that he's doing now, I don't think there's been a radical shift at all in the theory. I think, the refinements and so on. At the time of Soul Dust, he was quite happy, I think, to embrace an illusionist label. And the first chapters of Soul Dust are really quite a good statement of the illusionist position. And he does use the analogies of the metaphor of magic, stage magic, and so on. He talks about a magic show and so on. So it's really quite robustly illusion. Now, I don't think he's really changed that basic position, but I think what he's doing, and to some extent, this is what Dennett is doing. What I'm doing, he's changed. He has this picture, and he's trying to get people to see it and to recognize that it's a different way of thinking about consciousness and a better way. And so it's not that we've got detailed sort of arguments from premises to conclusions. It's trying to get people to look at conceptualize the whole thing differently. And so we try out different ways. Think of it like this. Think of it like a magic show. Okay, think of it like a surrealist painting. Think of it like this. It's trying to break down that those Cartesian intuitions, while at the same time doing justice to their strength. That's the balancing act you've got to do. Is it
Humphrey who refers to it as phenomenal surrealism?
I think yes. He's used the term surrealism. He's the red is more red than real red.
Yes, it's actually even better that you make this conclusion.
And it's again, and the point is that he would want to emphasize there is that I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that it's a creation. Surrealist paintings, these are creations, these are interpretations of the world by artists, which is what our brains are. So I think he's wanting to emphasize as you said, illusion can seem like a negative thing. You've got it wrong. No, he's saying we've got it massively right in that we've created this wonderful thing. It's not, a sort of piece of the furniture of reality. It's a creation that we've sculpted for ourselves to enrich reality in the way that artists do. So I think what he's trying to do there is develop a vocabulary for expressing essentially the same view that does more justice to the positive aspects, the creative aspects of it. I think that's right. I would need to get down into, there are a few things that Nick says sometimes that I'm not sure I'm quite happy with, but I think certainly the Soul Dust picture, I like that very much. And I don't think there have been radical changes, but yes, it's a matter of trying to find a vocabulary, a set of thought experiments, intuition pumps, analogies that help to get this picture across.
Do you think Magicism would have been a better term?
Magicism. I did originally want to call the illusion problem the magic problem. I think it was Dave Chalmers who persuaded me to call it the illusion problem, which I think he may regret himself.
It was possibly a great way to help formulate the meta problem at that point.
Yes, the trouble is, of course, if I called it the magicism, then, well, that suggests something, and that could be misread as
it could have come across as more
there really metaphysical. And any single word is going to carry connotations that you don't want because it's a complex position. One thing I do like about illusionism is that I do like the fact that it provokes people a little bit, because yes, some of them just see the word, get a vague idea of what it is, and get provoked and just don't bother engaging. But others get a bit provoked and think, that's intriguing. What could he possibly mean? And then they get drawn in and have a look and find out, oh, right, he's not saying, that I'm not really like awake or something. I'm not really seeing things. He's saying that this common conception of what it is to see things that's common in the Western tradition, the Cartesian tradition, is wrong. And I do like that. I like one reason I like the illusion metaphor is because of the connection with stage magic. Again, Dennett has repeatedly used this. And the great thing here is that stage magic is all about creating an effect. And this is what consciousness, whatever it is, I think it's an evolved feature, and it's being created because it's what it does. It's not an epiphenomenon. Just to think of that it doesn't do anything, I think, is ridiculous, because it's supposed to be so important to us, right? Now, if it's so important to us, then it's going to come under selectional pressure. And I think, think of it in terms of the effect. What effect are our experiences having on us? What effects are they having in regard to our reactions to the world? What effects are they having with regard to our conception of ourselves and our self ability to control and manipulate ourselves and communicate about ourselves? Think about the effect. And now the effect is kind of wondrous. And so is the effect of a magic show, levitation. It's a wondrous effect. How could that possibly be done? It seems to be a hard problem. It doesn't seem to conflict with everything that we know about the way the world works. And there's another aspect to this analogy that I particularly like, which is that when you know how the levitation is done, you're disappointed. You think, oh, it's just that. Oh, it's disappointing. You don't really want to know. And that's a feeling like, what? It's just brain activity. Oh, it can't be that. This can't be just brain activity. It's, well, the effect it had on me was so much more. It's like that feeling of the disappointed child who sees how the trick's done. Tricks are never, you don't want to reveal the trick because it's disappointing. That's how I feel about the brain. Although actually in this case, the brain science is pretty amazing too.
Yeah, I mean, there are some very good theories as well. If you think about, I mean, I know Nicholas tries to also give the evolutionary basis for why it should happen. And he does a very good job. I've read Soul Dust, I've read Seeing Red. But Michael also talks about attention schema theory. So he tries to address both the heart problem and meta problem by just doing the same thing. He calls it a caricature. He refuses to be labeled as an illusionist. but he acknowledges the fact that it is very much a theory of illusionism.
He doesn't like the term. Yes, I like Michael's work a lot. I think he's relatively few scientists who is approaching consciousness from this perspective. And he's producing really exciting work, I think, that is an outline at least of an illusionist science of consciousness. I certainly think that the attention schema thing is part of the story. I think we're going to need more than that. I think we're going to need more kinds of self-modeling as well as modeling of attention. I think we're going to need modeling at least of the reactive process, something like a reaction schema. Because I think when our intuitions about the feel of experience are not just to do with where our attention is directed, but about the impact that stimuli are having on us. The qualities of experience, these are things that are meaningful for us. Well, obviously in the case of pains and pleasures and so on, but I think colors and sounds and tastes and things, they're not just like a sort of gratuitous add-on to make the world more interesting. It's packed with significance. That's nice. That's not nice. It's far from taking the sort of affective dimension out of consciousness. I think Illusionist puts it right back in there. It's not just a kind of like a sideshow that's just incidental to all the real information processing. It's packed with information about the importance of things, the significance, the way that the world is impacting on us, the reactions that it's evoking. So this story we're telling, it isn't like a sort of idle, sort of fairy story that just to amuse ourselves. It's a story about what things mean.
Yes, I think that a lot of the times when we're talking about even the perceptual illusions, a lot of people seem to disregard them as quirks, but not merely quirks. This is how we function. This is meant to be the way we're meant to react to this.
Or the worst, it's at least it might be it's a side effect of something that is highly adaptive. Sometimes these are the sensory systems have used shortcuts and so on, and these are side effects of them. But there's always they're not just just sort of mysterious things designed to puzzle us. No.
But it's fascinating because once you adopt certain theories, for example, if you're looking at free will, illusionism, trying to figure out consciousness, there are so many ethical implications to all of these discussions. I mean, once you adopt, for example, the fact that determinism is true when you're talking about free will, there are lots of studies that show that when people believe this, they're less likely to have accountability for their actions. What do you think are the philosophical implications of illusionism?
The philosophical or ethical?
Sorry, the ethical implications. Yeah.
Well, now you make a good point there that I don't think that, just to take determinism for that, I don't think determinism has any negative implications, but a misunderstanding of it might have. If people think that if people think that the truth of determinism would somehow mean that they are constrained in what they can do, that would be, I guess, bad. Of course, they're not. The only thing that's constraining them is themselves, is their own. You can't be constrained by your own cognitive processes. By, my brain made me do it, sir. No, you are your brain. You're constrained by outside influences. You might be also constrained by certain habits and things that you've developed yourself, but then they are part of you, and they've got ways in which you can deal with them. Determinism itself doesn't constrain you. But you might think it does, and that might be worrying. So, okay, now with illusionism, I don't think it has negative consequences at all. In fact, I think it has rather benign consequences. I mentioned earlier that it helps to dissolve this sense of our each being radically isolated from each other, inhabiting private little metaphysical bubbles, as it were. I think other people's mental lives are not hidden from us in that way, or just contingently connected to the way they're reacting to the world. If we study another person with enough sensitivity and enough detail, we can know what the world is like for them, and that, I think, puts us in a much better position to understand them, to empathize, to care about them. So I think this brings us closer to each other. I like that. I think this is. I
think even when you take into account that sort of humility that comes with it, the fact that we're taking ourselves away from this top of the pinnacle that we keep putting ourselves back on.
Absolutely. And it's, for instance, one question that always, from a realist perspective on phenomenal consciousness, there's always this question: which other creatures possess it? And it seems to be a kind of on-off thing. Either there is this inner world or there isn't. I mean, do octopuses have an inner world? Well, maybe it's very different from ours, but they either do or they don't. It's on or off. So in which creatures is it on and which creatures is it off? Mm-hmm. What's it like to be about? What's it like to be an octopus? We can't tell. All we can do is map their sensitivities and reactions. Mm. We can't pierce through those to some pure phenomenal essence. So their conscious, and if you think that consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is what really matters ethically, this means that the grounds for ethical concern are systematically hidden from us. Mm. We can never tell whether we should care about octopuses. Well, that's a pretty depressing view, I think. It's kind of, you think, well, so what, your intuitions, octopuses, no, unconscious, my intuitions can't. That's it. I can't convince you. Now, look at it. Remove the idea that there's this radically private inner world and that all there is this hugely complex set of sensitivities and reactions, and we can start making progress. We can study octopuses and find out what they're sensitive to and what kind of reactions different things provoke in them. And then we can ask ourselves, does it matter to you that a creature with those sensitivities and those patterns of reactions is being injured in that way?
I mean, even dolphins, if you look at the way dolphins react to humans, they can communicate, they sort of lie, they have this way of interacting. Something funny I saw the other day, it was the dolphins understand us, but we still barely understand dolphins. It's quite quite fascinating. But I know you've written, you were part of the Cambridge Handbook of Cognitive Science, one of the authors, and the Cambridge Handbook of Artificial Intelligence. So I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts now moving forward with illusionism, and what are the possibilities moving forward regarding artificial intelligence and just the cognitive sciences in general?
Well, look again, one of the problems for AI, this is a really interesting, one of the big questions there is, can we make artificial consciousness? And could we know if we'd made it? Well, again, we can create systems with certain abilities, with certain kinds of perceptual sensitivities, and with certain then that can use perceptual information to regulate their behavior and to generate a whole raft of responses. And we can know, we can map those in great detail. Maybe we could make ones that have the same range of sensitivities and reactive dispositions that we have. Would it be conscious? Well, it all depends on what you think, again, what you think is necessary to produce consciousness. If it's something extra, something over and above all of those things, what causes it to emerge? Is it enough to produce the same sorts of information processing activities, the same sensitivities and reactions? Or do you have to produce that in the same way that, produce those things in the same way that they're produced in humans, using biological materials? Is there something special about biological materials that causes consciousness to emerge, and artificial materials, silicon or whatever, wouldn't?
And that's something that
possibly,
and that is something that John Saul talks about.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
the Chinese room experiment, for example.
Yes. The point is, if you look at it that way, there's no way to know whether you've produced it. You know that you say you've produced a creature like some intelligent robots in science fiction that can talk to us and tell us that and say, yes, I'm conscious, I'm experiencing things. Still, maybe all you've produced is a creature that thinks it's conscious, that reacts as if it's conscious, but it doesn't really have this essence. Maybe it hasn't. The essence of consciousness hasn't really emerged because you've not used the right materials. Or because you've created these responses in a different way to the way they're created in us, or something like this. There's some difference.
That can actually add an element of risk, because ideally, if we do get to a point where we've created these artificial intelligence machines that act like us, speak like us, behave like us, at what point are we going to give them the rights that we think we deserve?
Well, again, it's exactly the same situation with animals. If you think that this matter is determined by whether they possess some extra feature that is radically private, that only they can really know whether they have it or not, then all you've got are intuitions. And you might systematize those intuitions into some sort of theory and say, okay, this thing emerges when you have this kind of information processing, or when you have these kind of components, biological components or whatever. But you can't test it because you can't get into the creature's mind and see whether the lights have come on, whether the phenomenal lights have come on. You can't get past the reactions to the phenomenal reality. So it's the answer to this ethical question is going to be forever hidden from you. The best you can do is guess at it. And
I think we've already started doing that to a sense. I mean, the types of animals we've studied. We looked at chimpanzees, orangutans. We've always looked at ones that were similar to us to find these correlates. And then when you look at an octopus and how far away it is from us, the relationship's so different. The evolution of an octopus is so far from us. And then you can see that still this being has so much cognition going on. It's doing such intriguing and fascinating things. There's no need to project some sort of an essence onto it. This being has its own experience.
Exactly. It's, the alternative perspective to the one I was just outlining is the illusionist one, which is whatever judgments we make should be made on the basis of the kind of sensitivities and reactive dispositions the creature has. So just study the creature, see what it's sensitive to, see what effects things have on it, what kind of psychological effects, emotional effects, if you think it has emotion systems, what kind of behavioral effects. How does this affect it? And does it matter to you that it's affecting it in that way? That's seems to me a perfectly sound basis. In fact, the only real basis for making these decisions. I mean, suppose there were this phenomenal essence in their heads. Well, what difference does that make to the creature? Suppose there is this, say, phenomenal essence of like extreme pain, but the creature is kind of not noticing it. And it's not having, it's being projected in the inner cinema, but sort of the homunculus that watches the inner cinema is asleep and it's not reacting to it. Well, so why would that matter? And it's the only things in the end that matter are effects, how the world is impacting on us. And that would go for the inner world too, as far as I can see, unless you think that somehow this inner world is a separate thing, quite separate from the the rest of the cognitive system, the rest of the psychology, and it's a kind of like an entity in itself, and what happens to that thing matters intrinsically to the thing itself, rather than to the, if it's not having any effects on me, but it's having effects to the thing, we're back to a soul, back to a Cartesian soul. If you think there is this non-physical substance that enters these states, and those states matter for the thing itself, yeah, right, okay, then I can get that. But if I'm just an organism, then anything that's happening in my brain has to have some effects on the rest of the rest of the organism for me as the organism to care about it. So I think that we still haven't got rid of the Cartesian dualism, and the Cartesian dualism is affecting the way we think about other animals, and the way we think about artificial intelligence. And, you know, if we put together the right components in the same way, would the lights suddenly come on? Would this inner world spring into existence? That's the wrong way to think about it. It's not only the wrong way to think, even if it were the right way to think about it, it wouldn't get us anywhere. We'd still have to think about it in the illusionist way, even if realism were true, because you can't do anything with the realist way. It's putting all the relevant facts completely beyond our powers of inquiry. So you can't do AI on a Cartesian basis, even if Cartesianism were true.
Yeah.
So you've got, in practice, this is the thing that Dennett often says, that, you know, scientists are effectively illusionists because all they're studying in the end are reactions.
True. That's very true. I think another way to look at some of the ethical implications would be, there is a field in psychiatry known as phenomenological psychopathology. And the very essence of phenomenological psychopathology is obviously phenomenology. It is the very focus, the very core of this treatment basis. And they try to look at patients not merely as and nothing but, because of course it can come across as very, very much reductive. We can sound very reductive when we say we are inherently these chemical reactions, we are inherently all these neurotransmitters communicating to each other. But when you take on that phenomenological perspective, you tend to treat someone more like a person. So I think that's a certain aspect where I think ethical dilemmas will arise with the illusionist view.
There's nothing in illusionism that is incompatible with that approach. Because when you take that approach, you're simply asking people to talk to you about what it's like for them. And that is completely relevant from an illusionist perspective, because it's another kind of reaction. What their story is, what their self-narrative is, that's the heart of the matter. Okay? Yes, you must know their self-narrative. How else are you going to know how things are affecting them? How are they vibrating in response to the world? Absolutely. And the more you can get of that self-narrative, the better. And of course, you don't say to them, oh, your self-narrative is wrong, it's just an illusion. You say, that's your self-narrative. And it is their self-narrative. It's not like, it's like, you don't go to an author like Conan Doyle and say, oh, yeah, that's wrong. You got that role wrong about Sherlock Holmes. No, that's your creation. It's like, again, with Humphrey, with the surrealism. This is what you've created. This is your creative interpretation of yourself. And that's incredibly valuable. It's incredibly important for you. And it's important for us in trying to understand you. Yeah. All that illusionist says is, don't assume, though, that narrative is a literal report of an inner world that has all those entities just as described in the narrative. Just as you don't read Sherlock Holmes stories, you don't have to assume that there really was this, individual in Baker Street and so on. It's treating these reports as you treat like poetry or fiction and so on. They can be immensely expressive, and they can tell you really important things about human life and so on. It's just that they're telling it in a fictionalized vocabulary, if you like. But they're still using it to express things that are absolutely.
I agree. I don't think they're at odds in any way. I do agree.
I think.
Sorry.
I do worry, because you said this earlier, that people may think that there is this opposition, and it's not just the name. I mean, the doctrine itself, if it's not understood well, and this isn't a criticism of people who understand it well, people don't have time to study philosophy. And in fact, if you don't know, I mean, it was I like the way you started by asking a bit about the history, because you need to know how we got into this situation in order to know why you need this remedy to get out of it. Mm. And if I just sort of propose this theory just out of the blue with no context, if phenomenal realism weren't the dominant position, then this would seem strange. Why are you saying this? But the point is, there's this whole tradition of several hundred years that has infected our philosophical thinking, and still infects not just philosophy, but the way science is done, the way we think about artificial intelligence, and it's distorting it. Mm-hmm. And so you have to sort of say, no, stop, that's wrong, that's an illusion. And, but the way that that's presented within those philosophical traditions, maybe it should be presented in a somewhat different way for a lay audience. Mm.
I think you're touching on a great point, because I wanted to conclude by giving you an opportunity for some final defenses. What are the final defenses you could possibly give to someone who is questioning illusionism and has some doubts about the theory? I think you do a great job in your Aeon piece. I read it today, and I think, because that was directed at a specific type of audience, because you were not talking to philosophers, scientists, talking to the layperson reading this. I think your approach there is very good. So I think you should.
I'm working on this. I'm working on a popular presentation of this. So this is all good, practice in trying. And what I'm doing every time I talk about this, I'm trying out new, sometimes off the top of my head, new metaphors, new analogies, new ways of trying to get it across. And I think I have the core idea fairly clear, but the way of trying, the best way to communicate it, the best way to get, it's when you said about arguments and defenses, that's what gave me a pause, because it's not that I've got a series of I start with this premise, and I start with the premise of, say, physicalism or something, and then move to this and this and this, and then you go into illusion. It's not like that. It's more a matter of we're looking at it the wrong way. So one metaphor I've been using recently is, standing on a different hill to look at the landscape and look everything. You see different alignments between things, and I think that's the way Dennett has been doing this. If you read his book, Consciousness Explained, it'll be frustrating because there doesn't seem to be, sort of a rigorous argument for the position. Mm. It's just a kind of a lot of thought experiments and analogies and suggestive descriptions. And yes, that's exactly what it is, because he's trying to get you to come over here and have a look at the landscape from that perspective.
Consciousness Explained is sort of an intuition pump book for illusionism.
Yes, absolutely, and which is we need to pump the counterintuitive in the counter Cartesian intuitions. Mm. So it's easy to pick up on particular notions, to take the term illusion and say, look, illusions have these features and this doesn't have these features, so that's kind of superficial. Many of the objections, I think, misunderstand the position, though perhaps in ways that are natural and that I should have done more to combat, and which I do more to anticipate. Really, the best way to get somebody the best way to defend the position, I think, is to try and keep explaining it better and get people to try and adopt it, at least as an experiment. Mm-hmm. Try looking at it this way, because I think if you don't actually try to inhabit the perspective and see things through the illusionist spectacles, you will, the intuitive resistance, because you're still stuck in a Cartesian mindset, the intuitive resistance will be so strong that you just won't, you'll maybe come up with some objections, and I can maybe give you some responses to those objections, but you still won't be satisfied. You say, yeah, well, whatever, you're saying that, but still, it's just, can't be right. So the best form of defense, I think, is to keep trying to present it in more accessible, more friendly, more intuitive ways. Mm. There aren't really intuitive ways of thinking about consciousness.
A lot of people, I'm not sure, are you familiar with the work of Derren Brown?
Oh yes, I call my website Tricks of the Mind.
Yes, and, exactly. And he's written a book called Tricks of the Mind as well.
Yes, he has. I've got a copy.
Because that was actually one of the ways I steered into this route. It was watching the type of brain tricks he performs on people, the mentalism, to show people exactly how much we misinterpret things.
What's so cool about Derren's work, I think, is that a lot of what he does, as I understand it, is just standard, conjuring tricks that are, methods are known for a long time. But whereas conjurers traditionally presented this as magic, as some kind of, just supernatural thing, he presents it as super psychology.
Exactly.
So what he's using is using super psychological powers. It's not magic. It's not that. It's my super psychological powers that maybe you could develop. And it's not super psychology. It's tricks. It's trickery.
Exactly.
But he makes you think it's super psychology. And I love that. And again, I think another one of his books is called Pure Effect. This is the thing why I like the analogy with magic. It's about effect. You don't need to have phenomenal consciousness. Having the effect of it will be enough.
Yes.
Dennett again, what happens then? What happens when there's the presentation? What's the effect on the audience? Do they feel that something wonderful has happened? Do they feel a lot of people... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
A lot of people tend to think these representations are occurring as an image, where we know you're not really saying that.
No.
I think another great person who describes this very well is Carl Friston. Carl Friston, when he talks about inference, he talks about how when you take in certain stimuli, you're not going to infer that there is, for example, a red sunset. You're not going to infer the fact that electromagnetic radiation has hit your retina, is converted via the optic nerve, gone into your brain and done that. You're going to infer the most easily accessible explanation amid this array of bombarding information. You have to somehow focus on something specific. It's too difficult for us to actually acknowledge each neural connection. That's just impossible. From an energy conserving perspective, and I think he talks about the free energy principle, you have to sort of conserve energy. That's the bottom line. Fake it till you make it when it comes to consciousness.
You don't need to know either. This is the thing. Your brain is doing it. Your brain is doing a wonderful job, and it's getting on with it all the time, and it's generally doing a marvelous job. And a lot of the time, you really don't. You, as the person, as it were, you don't need a story about what the brain is doing. You don't need to ask yourself what the brain is doing. You don't need to tell anybody. You just need to get on and do it. If you're playing sports or something, you're right in the moment. You're in the zone. You're not in your head, as it were. Then you're in the world. You are just something in the world, interacting with the world in a rich and complex and quite wonderful way. And you don't any longer seem to be in a private world in your head. It's only when you start questioning whether things go wrong, maybe, and what's that? What did I see there? Could it have been that? Oh, am I imagining things? Now then you start getting it. Or somebody says to you, wait a minute, what are you thinking about? A penny for your thoughts. Or how did that feel? Now you start having to sort of look inward, introspect, and you have to come up with some sort of story about what's happening in there. And you don't have a clue really about what's happening in there, because all this talk about representations and information processing and prediction and stuff, that's all happening at what somebody calls a sub-personal level. It's not things you're doing, it's things your brain is doing that enable you to do the things you do. You're playing sports, say, your brain is doing a heck of a lot of information processing with dealing with sensory signals, things that enable you to play sports, to play cricket or whatever it is, and also enable you to ask yourself, what's happening with me and what am I doing and what's my brain doing? But of course, we don't really think of ourselves as, we don't think of it that way. We don't think that our brains are doing it. We think that we're doing it. Okay, so we're playing sports. How did you play that shot? How did I play that shot? I don't know. I guess I saw the ball and thought it was going a bit wide and that I'd have a little, I'd have a flash at it, and I made contact, and I don't know. My brain did it really, but I've got to tell a story.
In fact,
the
more we try to intervene and try to explain these things, I'm worse at the task. I mean, absolutely. If you're really trying to focus on the ball, you might not be as good as in any case. But I think another great way to highlight that the illusionist view is beautiful. It is one of those views that can actually be poetic, is to think about it I often say we are perceiving persons, organized by organs, designed by DNA, manufactured by molecules, assembled by atoms, forged by fusion via stellar supernovae. Once you take into this whole account that our atoms were formed in stars, etc., you are part of this universe, not apart from this universe. And the fact of the matter is, it's not a human experiencing, it's what is it like to be in the universe. It is the universe experiencing what it is like to be a human. That is actually what's going on here.
Yes, I underlined that in your paper. I like this, a lovely way of putting it, and I do like that. Yes, we need to sort of get over ourselves a little bit. It's this. I mean, we are wonderful. We're wonderful things. We're wonderful biological creatures with wonderful capacities, but we're not metaphysically special. I don't think we're not like some special extra ingredient in the universe. We don't have some essence that is not present in other things, in other complex things that wouldn't be present in suitably complex robots, or maybe is not present in animals. We don't. It seems to us that we do, and that, of course, is central to Humphrey's story. He says that this idea that we have this special private in the world makes us relish life and engage with the world in a richer way. It's a kind of wonderful extra thing that evolution has given us. But it's still just a sense of having it. It's not really having it. We're not that special. We may think we're special, and our thinking we're special may be a good thing, but we're not that special. Consciousness is an amazing thing, but it's not, absolutely out of this world.
Consciousness is really the 21st century vitalism.
I do think so. And
the more we figure it out, I think the more added layers of some sort of an essence will appear. I think it's culturally ingrained. I think it's religiously ingrained. I think there's so many elements that hinder this process from happening.
And the important thing is we're not going to lose anything. Yeah. It's not like, the sunset is going to look any less wonderful if you accept this account of it, of what's happening when you experience it. The pain is not going to be, sadly, the pain is not going to be any less unpleasant. It's just that we're going to have a richer understanding of what is occurring when you see the sunset, when you feel the pain. And in a way, one of the reasons I resist treating consciousness in this metaphysical ways, it kind of just draws a line under explanation. It says, well, this just emerges. That's it. We don't know how. Can't explain it. It's just an extra feature. It just emerges. So what? We can't really investigate it then? No, it's just let's try. Let's see if we can understand. And that understanding doesn't take away the wonder. Understanding life doesn't take away the wonder of life. If anything, it adds to it.
Richard Feynman talks about that very well. He talks about that flower. I mean, just because he has a friend who's a painter, I think, and he talks about the fact that we break down this flower with science. We talk about the cells, we talk about the molecules, and he talks about how, yes, the fact that we can see each added layer of this flower adds so much more beauty to this flower. You can think about the fact that it evolved to do certain things, that bees are coming to interact with this to do certain things. I mean, there's so many extra layers of information that make it so much more elegant.
Right. Or think about literature and poetry. If somebody had read a novel, taking it to be an historical account of of real events, and we said, no, actually, it's just a fiction. They're not going to say, oh, well, it means nothing to me now. In a way, it's precisely because novels can pull together so much of human experience and put it together and package it in a way that is so that creates such an effect upon us that maybe a mundane story of the actual events wouldn't. That's what makes it so wonderful. That's what poetry. Again, we're back to Humphrey again. This creativity, the way that a poem it distorts in a really creative way, in an expressive way, and a mundane account of a sunset or seeing a bunch of daffodils wouldn't have anything like the effect that a poem can do. I mean, so it's far from an anti, what's the word I'm looking for? Not anti-humanist, anti-Philistine sort of perspective, as I see it.
I think even when you think about, because a sunset is beautiful. We talk about sunsets, beautiful. It's something people love to look at. But if you take what the sun really is, this white star, we don't get to see the actual elegance that is a white star because of our environment and because of the atmosphere that's blocking that. But an astronaut or somebody who's been to space can tell you about the sheer elegance of seeing real white light, even though we know that's just an array of different spectrums of light combined. But the fact that we know that doesn't take away anything from it. I think having more, you're right, Humphrey does a great job at communicating this in a way that makes it a lot more accessible to people to fall in love with it.
Absolutely. I mean, Soul Dust is a lovely book. I always encourage people to read that book because he has, and the opening chapters are very hard-headed physicalist, very clear on his metaphysical position. And then it blossoms into this wonderful account of consciousness, which draws on poetry and music and painting and mysticism. And I mean, it really does do justice to the wonder of the thing he's talking about. And he shows how you can...
My copy of Soul Dust, the pages have become so yellow. Just
I remember when I first met Nick, I gave a little reply to a presentation he gave, and I said, I think I want to thank Nick because he's shown me how, as a physicalist, I can save my soul. And
I think even the fact that he named the book Soul Dust shows that as a physicalist, he has this innate ability to want to make this romantic. He wants to add layers of just enjoyment.
Absolutely,
because I think when you look at Derren Brown's interviews, although when he's performing, he's trying to sell this idea of super psychology and whatever. But when he does an interview and he tells you about the fact that he's trying to expose these charlatans, all these people who are trying to convince you that you have these extra layers, he goes and attacks these people who think they are psychics and can read other people's minds, and he shows you exactly that if you take a reductive and not a nothing but manner, it's not nothing but, it's more understand each layer of reality and then paint yourself a more holistic picture.
Absolutely. And a sense of wonder and that is rooted in a clear perception of how things are. It's so much more valuable one that's rooted in fantasies.
I think another person that I'm not sure if you're familiar with Oliver Sacks' work, but
yes,
amazing way of just taking these scientific elements from neurology, neuroscience, and psychology, but making it so easily accessible and so beautiful. And I actually based this when I started this podcast. It was all because he was the first person to make me fall in love with this field. So all these writers, I think, who have this ability to communicate this in ways that make it accessible, I think will help this account. So Humphrey does do a fantastic job of that. And I think your second paper where you talk about illusionism and you try to counter each argument from everyone else also does a very good job at explaining all of this, because I've read that as well.
Thanks for reading that. That's at the end of the volume, and so not sure how many people get to that one. But
I just don't think anybody takes the time to really get to that point, which is a difficult.
Yes, I do want. I say I am working on a popular presentation, but I want to get it right. You see, it's easy to write for a philosophical audience because it's the kind of the rules of the game are kind of set out, and you know what sort of moves you make, and they make those moves and you make these moves, and everybody kind of understands it, and so on, and there you've established it, whatever, with these caveats and so on and so forth. But it's often these papers have a lot of clever moves in them, but very little reflection on the nature of the game itself.
Yes.
And if you want to write a popular piece, and I don't mean popular in a dismissive way at all, I mean a piece for people who aren't obsessive, philosophy, like obsessive chess players, you can't just take the game for granted. You've got to explain why we're playing this game in the first place. And what's the point of it? And you've got to, and sometimes you see that really, it's not even about that particular game. It's about getting I'm sorry, I'm losing track. I'm losing grip of my metaphor here. But maybe the game we should be playing is a somewhat different one, or it's
the game. The game needs to be tailored more towards the spectators rather than the players.
Certainly that.
Because the players have they have access to so much more information. They know exactly what's going on from a first person, a subjective experience. Whereas the spectators are often coming in not really understanding, why did the player do that? Why did he not shoot for goal? What's going on here?
Yeah, exactly.
But he knows why he didn't shoot for goal. He knows all these things.
Exactly.
And that's the thing. When you're writing for a philosophical audience, they know exactly what you're talking about. But
also, my metaphor didn't really bring this out. But there's a big disadvantage to that way of doing philosophy. It's that it blinds you to the stuff that's not on the chessboard, as it were. All you're concerned with is the moves that can be made within this chess game. You're not seeing the interaction between yourself and your opponent in any wider context. Okay, so maybe the chessboard is a way of sort of having a competition with somebody, but there's whole context, a whole human context to the interaction, and that's what you kind of miss. You just focus on the moves on the chessboard. You don't see the point. Why are we even playing this game? Is it part of some wider context? Is it part of some wider difference that you and I have? Or is it just a chess game? In which case, why should anybody be interested in it outside the chess fraternity? And I think there's a danger that philosophy is like that. But ideally, what we're doing when we do these philosophy papers, we make these moves, is we're trying to map spaces in possible theoretical positions that have real world consequences. These kings and queens and so on, they represent real people, and the pawns, and it's a metaphor for it's a representation of a real world situation, and we can lose that. I think that's where I should have gone with it. What does the game represent?
I was also thinking about it as when you look at virtual realities, at some point we're reaching a point where we're going to have these virtual realities, and at what level of complexity is someone going to actually say, is that not just another reality?
Yes, I know David Chalmers has just written a big new book on this, which I haven't read.
Yes, I've noticed he's now into the virtual reality world, because it is quite fascinating when you take into account when you're putting on another mind on top of a mind. We're not talking about Supermind and Mind, your publication, but you're basically adding another sort of because people are going to start adding an ethereal entity to that once it becomes a lot more accurate, because that's already a case now. People think this could be its own virtual reality. This is the Matrix in a sense. So we're just adding more matrices to this game. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I haven't thought a lot about this, so I don't have anything very profound or deep to say. I mean, obviously, you've got to have some sort of base reality where there is the base level of computation being done, the basic level of cognition. So if you have put on a virtual reality headset, then it's my brain that's doing the computation on the signals. Now, if this world and my brain is itself part of a simulation, then there must somewhere be some other cognitive system that is doing the processing of the signals that representing my body and so on. Okay, so you don't I don't see how it's got to bottom out in some sort of in some kind of cognitive system somewhere. And then, as you say, we can add layers and layers of it. I'm not so sure. I mean, look, okay, so here's something I'm going to say. I don't know whether I agree with it. Is this all that different from things that humans have been doing for a long, long time, sitting around the fire and telling each other stories and going into the world of Odysseus and the Trojan War and so on, and the Hindu myths and these kind of things? Is it that much different? It's supplying it. What humans have got this wonderful technique, and this is again something I've taken from Dennett. They've learned that they don't just have to wait for the world to stimulate them. They can stimulate themselves. It's like there's some kinds of experiences that are really interesting and nice, and sort of like having an adventure is nice, and it may be, but you can create an artificial adventure by having someone tell you a story, or reading a story, or telling yourself a story if you're an imaginative person. And we've been doing this for as long as we've had language, I'm sure. And it's one of the great things that language does. It enables us to auto. And I think this is very much connected with this idea of our having a private inner world, because after all, where does the story take you? It's taking you somewhere that's not there. It's into a world of imagination. Where is that? It's in your mind. And, you know, now I'm not sure that virtual reality is, modern virtual reality is doing anything radically different from that. It's just providing a richer sense, a richer stream of stimulation.
I think what it could do is actually show people precisely how possible it is to create these experiences in a machine that we've basically constructed within. So I think those are going to be some of the philosophical implications of virtual realities at some point.
This will be really interesting. I think we can pretty much almost do this now. You can have a remote hookup to and then there's a wonderful story by Dennett, the work called "Where Am I?" You could have be hooked up remotely to an Android that, you know, with their visual sensors, you know, the auditory sensors, and you get touch feedback and so on, haptic feedback and so on. And so you operate, you sort of close your eyes, whatever, and you close your eyes, you look at the headset, and you operate the Android as if you were kind of inhabiting its body. Now as I understand, what happens when people do this is they tend to shift perspective, and they actually tend to feel as if they are there inside the Android looking out. They are there inside the robot, looking out of its eyes. And if this got sufficiently rich, and maybe they got, say, also they got some interoceptive feedback from the state of the android's body, damage, pain, other bodily systems, temperature, all of this, and they got all that as well, and we could hook all this. They might get to the point where they really felt completely that they had, that this self inside there that seems to be in here had transferred itself over there into the robot, and that might help them to see this, to appreciate the sense in which this is a construction. This self is a construction, which can be attached to different bodily entities. It's not that this somehow sort of created, this hookup sort of created, caused a self to emerge over there and the one over here to sort of disappear, or this one to somehow fly over there. It's a construction, it's a narrative being created by your brain, originally a narrative tied to what's happening to this body, and now tied to what's happening to that one.
Exactly.
So it might help to loosen that sense.
Yeah, so Keith, in terms of the plans moving forward with Illusionism, or what's going on there?
Well, I'm writing, I keep writing pieces, both academic pieces, but for scholarly pieces for journals, and also popular pieces, and increasingly trying to write popular pieces. Again, not using popular in any derogatory sense. Was it William James? I don't think it was William James who said it, but someone said, if you can't express it clearly, you don't understand it yourself. And nothing makes me, was it? It's attributed to Shakespeare, I'm not sure. Nothing makes me think harder about what I really mean than trying to express it for a wide audience, a popular audience. It's easy to just rely on slogans when you're writing a scholarly piece. So I'm keen to that, and that's going to build up, all that stuff eventually is going to build up into what I hope will be a widely read book on illusionism, trying to present it. The title, the provisional title for that is, I'll tell you, is Descartes' Prison.
Okay, interesting.
So, and it's about escaping from it, of course. So that's the long-term project.
Considering there's been a Descartes era, Galileo's era, so I think I kind of like the Descartes' Prison.
Something seems to be a generally good formula.
Someone's always starting the process. I'm actually going to chat to Philip Goff soon about.
Oh, great!
Yeah, yes. Galileo's era. So we'll be discussing that soon.
That's great. I have a very enjoyable interaction with Philip, and he's pursuing. He's investigating what happens if you take this intuition seriously, and where they take you, and he's doing that with a great deal of rigor and intelligence.
Yeah, it's strange because Philip, as a panpsychist, as someone who takes panpsychism as the view, he considers illusionism to be the second most coherent and logical one. I think if he had to choose any other one, he would possibly go to the other side.
I know David Chalmers said that. I didn't know Philip had committed to it as his. Yeah, I think yes, I think he does mention that, doesn't he, somewhere? But that's because we both share the reason that we agree on that. I mean, I agree that it's a choice between something quite inflationary, metaphysically inflationary, like panpsychism or illusionism, is that neither of us think that this middle position of being a realist about phenomenal consciousness, but saying that it's just physical, we don't think that works.
Yeah.
We think, you can't have your cake and eat it in that way. You can't be a realist and say, yes, they really have these mental qualities, but they're just physical states of the brain. We all, Chalmers, Goff, myself, we all agree on that. You can't have that. If you want to be a physicalist, it's not just about being a physicalist. It's about if you want to explain the brain, explain consciousness in neuroscientific terms, in naturalistic terms, then you've got to go the whole way and be an illusionist. And if you look actually back at the early mind-brain identity theorists from the 1950s, people like Ulin Place and J.J.C. Smart, they were quite clear about this. I mean, Ulin Place was quite clear about what he called the phenomenological fallacy, the idea that there really is, when you have an after image of green, seeing something green, that there really is something somehow green somewhere in your mind, if not in the world. He was quite clear about this. And I think philosophers have taken a sort of long loop away from that. And I'm trying to draw them back to it, really.
I think Thomas Metzinger also does it well. He says, I mean, it's an illusion that you think that when you dig into that brain, if you dig into the head, you're going to find something. All you find is just neural tissue, a bunch of neurons, a bunch of blood vessels, nothing else. There's no space in the... I think it's Dennett who says there is no room in the head for anything extra, but...
There's a great quotation here from Paul Brox, from his book Into the Silent Land. I'll just read it, called The Space Behind the Face. And he says, the illusion is irresistible. Behind every face, there is a self. We see the signal of consciousness in a gleaming eye and imagine some ethereal space beneath the vault of the skull, lit by shifting patterns of feeling and thought, charged with intention and essence. But what do we find in that space behind the face? When we look, he's a neurologist. The brute fact is that there is nothing but material substance, flesh and blood and bone and brain. I know, I've seen. You look down into an open head, watching the brain pulsate, watching the surge and tug and probe, and you understand with absolute conviction that there is nothing more to it. There's no one there. It's a kind of liberation.
It is.
Liberation. And then he goes on, the illusion is irresistible, but not indissoluble. And what's wonderful about that is, if this is a wonderful book, by the way, I recommend everyone to read it, Paul Brock's Into the Silent Land. It's a book about the brain, about written by he's a neurologist, isn't he? And it's that perspective that I just read, that is the one that informs it. But at the same time, it's a deeply humane book about the people who have these neurological conditions, and about his interactions with them as people, and how you can interact with people both as... The two things aren't incompatible. That vision of what's actually there in their brain isn't incompatible with your interacting with the person as a whole, as a human being, full of a complex, sensitive person. You can do both, and as a surgeon, you have to do both.
Exactly, you have to. I mean, the fact that we both are able to communicate right now talks about the fact that we know that we're convinced by each other's illusion, in a sense. So, I mean, you seem conscious to me. I seem conscious to you. We're both unzombie-like to each other. When you're approaching a person, you don't approach their consciousness, you approach the person. And I think that's what a lot of medical doctors, when we try to learn about it in med school, it's all about the person. It's not about the mind. It's not about, you have to take this whole being.
Consciousness the consciousness, your consciousness is there. It's in every inflection. Okay, hypothetically, I suppose you could be some sort of computer simulation. You could be some sort of complex android or something. But the likelihood of that is diminishingly small. I can see all the sensitivity there. And if we were to be together in the same room and were to spend some time together and have a drink and so on, I would, the possibility that any of this is kind of sort of created in some simplistic artificial way by a simple sort of computer program or something is tiny. Obviously, you're a living, breathing creature who is, as I like to use this thing, sort of vibrating in response to the world, response to what I say to you, how I look, and we are in a kind of complex dynamic, even through this artificial medium, we're in this complex kind of dynamical interaction. And that's real. And that the consciousness is there in the interaction. It's not residing in some ethereal realm where I can't access yours and you can't access mine. I mean,
and it's very easy to be convinced otherwise. I mean, Philip K. Dick, some of his novels, you look at Blade Runner, Westworld, all of these types of shows that show you exactly how easy it is for us to attribute this consciousness to something that's got absolutely no biological relation to us.
Yes, but are we wrong to do it? I mean, if they are, the idea is that you can look inside, you take off the face and it's just a lot of transistors or something inside, and you say, oh, it wasn't really conscious after all, even though it was behaving exactly like a human being, so it could be. But then you take off my face, as it were, as Brock says, and what are you going to find in there? You're going to find neurons. And saying, oh, and there's some spooky essence as well, doesn't make any difference to that, because what difference is what's the spooky essence doing?
Yeah. And actually taking off the face, there's nothing more alien than looking at a person without a face. I mean, it looks so out of this world.
Exactly.
It does not look anything like a human being once you remove that.
And that's exactly what it's a trope in science fiction. That's how you know that it's not. You don't really need to care about it, because you take it off and it's just transistors or something, or just circuits. That's that's a trope in science fiction. As you say, it doesn't show that the thing is a zombie. The whole idea of a zombie is a zombie's supposed to be something
it doesn't work.
The lights,
I don't like
the inner lights are off. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to me.
I'm not too happy. I'm not a fan of the argument. I don't think it's conceivable. I think especially when you take into account sort of the psychological zombies, as we mentioned earlier, that are possible with human beings who can almost be perceived as less conscious. I mean, so that means the opposite attribution.
This is something I really liked in your paper, that you shared a paper with me about how illusionist approach might be applied to schizophrenia, and I really liked that. It's a very promising approach, I think, to testing out illusionist ideas and seeing how they shed light on these cases. And one thing you described there is someone who's the sense of themselves, I think, has sort of broken down. They're not engaging with the world. They're not vibrating. I don't know whether this is a good metaphor. They're not vibrating with the world or with themselves in the way that they did. They're in the narrative as sort of broken down. It's not. They're not seeing themselves as a person who's richly engaged with the world, and so they are. And they seem kind of. They not display emotion. I guess they don't respond in a way that to question. I guess they don't respond to questions. And if you ask them how they are, I suppose they say, "What do I say? I don't know. I don't care."
Very ambivalent. There's almost nothing going on there.
And that is a good description of our sense of a zombie.
Exactly.
It's somebody whose inner life has collapsed, has fragmented. But it's not because some inner light has switched off. It's because their sensitivities, both to the world and to their own reactions to the world, have degraded, have broken apart. Their inner narrative isn't there. And that's a real zombie. in a sense. Not to be dismissive about it, but it's somebody who really is lacking something significant that is central to consciousness. So if what you mean by a zombie is someone who lacks the central thing that makes us conscious, that is a good description of a zombie.
That's what I like to somebody as almost a spectrum of attribution.
Absolutely.
We attribute consciousness based on a spectrum. If something slowly doesn't look as humane as us, we're going to attribute less consciousness to it.
Yes. And of course, one of the interesting things about, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, probably because I've been talking a long time, but one of the interesting things about Dennett's work, particularly on things like change blindness, is how we're often not sure what to attribute to ourselves in certain situations where a scene is changing and you don't notice that it's changing. Well, how do you describe your own experience? In change blindness, you look at a little video where some aspect of the scene changes quite radically, but because you're not focused on it, you don't notice it. But when you do notice it, it suddenly leaps out at you.
In the very popular example where the woman comes into while the guys are passing the ball, she comes in wearing a gorilla costume and then starts banging on the chest. I mean, you don't notice something so blatantly obvious.
Exactly. And so what was your experience like at that time before you noticed it? It seems the noticing is crucial. The noticing, not the mere existence of this thing, this display in a theatre, but you're noticing. Another, I'll do my pickle jar one since I like this one. I often do this one. It's one that strikes me quite powerfully. I don't know whether it works quite so well for other people, but you want some pickles, okay? You want to make a sandwich, and you open the fridge, and you scan the fridge, and you just don't see the jar of pickles. And so you shut the door and you shout to your partner, "Where are the pickles? Have we not got it?" And she says, "They're right there on the middle shelf. Look, open your eyes." And you look at, bang, they're there. How could you have missed them? Now, it's very tempting to say, now, what was it like when I looked in the fridge the first time? Now, obviously, the pickles were there, and your eyes must have, the light from the pickle jar must have bounced off them and registered in your retina and some way in your brain. But what was there in your experience? Was the pickle jar there was it shown in the Cartesian theatre in your head? If it was, why on earth did you not react? You were looking for them after all. If it wasn't, then what was shown at that location in the screen? Was there a hole in the fridge? If so, why didn't you notice that? That would have been weird. Did your brain fill it in with some other product? If so, what? What did it fill it in with? Ketchup or something? Why? Why would it do that? What was going? There's a temptation to think you could sort of press rewind on the mental tape and have another look, not at the fridge, but at your experience of the fridge and see what was there. You can't, because there isn't a tape. The point is, all there is a narrative of what, there's a set of reactions. You didn't react to the pickle jar. You didn't include it, as it were, in the narrative that's constructed, not only by what you say and take it up, but by the whole suite of your reactions. It didn't get into the story. That's it.
Even when you consider your nose, I mean, we don't see our nose every day. It's right there. But if you close one eye, you then tend to see it. It's invisible. The blind spot as well. We're taught when you're taking a driver's test, always check your blind spot. I mean, it's the point where your optic nerve is at the back of your eye. It's the one spot that doesn't have retinal cells that can transmit this information to your brain. And yet we go through our lives not noticing that we have a distinct spot in our vision that's completely non-existent. You can fit an entire car in someone's blind spot. That's how drastic it is.
We don't notice. We don't notice that. Until it's pointed out, you don't notice that you've only got detailed perceptual, visual information of a very small area in the center of your visual field that's actually hitting your fovea. The rest of it is all very sketchy and really quite hard. If you attend now to what's in front of you and try and describe what's around you, it's not just that it's not detailed. It's that you can't really even you can't say that it's an indistinct shape of this kind or that kind. It's like there's something or other, and I've kind of got a sense of it, but I can't tell you whether it's just like indistinct, and it shades off into nothingness. But you don't notice that. You don't go around noticing that everything's black behind you. It isn't black behind you. It's nothing behind you, because that's not part of your story.
And then again, this Cartesian thing always comes back, because then you'll get people who will say, it's only because we're not using 100% of our brains. We're only using 10%. I mean, these old, outdated notions and these old ways of thinking always somehow find their way back. I mean, we know we use as much of the processing power as we possibly can. There is no 10% theory.
Evolution can't afford to waste resources like that.
Exactly. So somehow they will always bring it back. I think the best way, as you said, is I think Descartes' prison is probably one of the best ways you can possibly move around this.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well, and it's been an interesting process since I started doing this, and particularly since I started writing more popular pieces about this, to see the kind of reactions that I get. The ones that just get a sort of sketchy idea and just reject it outright are not so interesting. But the people who really try to engage with it, and you see that they have this Cartesian picture, and they maybe understand some of the force of what I'm trying to say, but they can't get out of this way of thinking. And it's a really that is itself a very interesting fact about the human mind. I think that this, I'm assuming for the sake of argument that I'm right here, that I don't think these Cartesian intuitions that we have are just a product of culture. I think culture has elaborated them, but I think there is something about the nature of the way that the brain models its own activity. Yeah. Again, going back to Michael Graziano's work, that makes them very, very natural for us to develop. Mm. And once we've done this, and once they've taken root, it's really hard to see.
It's definitely
any other way.
There's definitely a cognitive dissonance that occurs the moment it happens. I mean, they've scanned brains where when you put someone up on a functional MRI, you tell them certain things that don't correspond to their religion or culture. Some of their brain activity sometimes just shuts down for a moment, and that cognitive dissonance occurs. And when that happens, the person automatically goes back to whatever they know. Because as an evolutionary basis, as a species trying to survive, it's always important to automatically go back to what you know. It's gotten you here so far. You might as well do it. So I think at that moment when someone is at that very edge, they reach that point where they just switch over and then they just don't accept it.
Absolutely. We need our stories. I mean, we are creatures who, I mean, this is something that, again, going back to Nicholas Humphrey, he talks about occupying the soul niche, a sort of niche we've created for ourselves, a cultural niche in which we think of ourselves as creatures with souls, interacting with other creatures with souls. And this is our environment that we've created for us, and where we live and where we function, and how we conceptualize each other and conceptualize. I mean, think of ourselves as having free will. Again, I suppose that's part of the way we tend to conceptualize our activity in the world. It's not inevitable. And I think there are better ways, but it's a very natural one, I think, and it's one that people, kind of need, at least until they've really got hold of something better. That's where they live. It's like, it's like, I don't know, it's like birdsong or whatever. It's a part of it's a culturally evolved feature of our existence that we can't just shrug off like that. That we can't just.
I personally think that as this century moves on, it seems to be that illusionism or illusion-like views are slowly, progressively are growing. And I think it starts with a lot of these illusions of the self. A lot of people are trying to enter the realm of Buddhism, trying to do a lot of meditation. They're starting off with these slow versions, but there's always that risk, because the moment you start going down that path, you might go down the quantum consciousness path. There's always this. It's either you're going to go to one or the other. You're going to take the jump. But I do think people that are generally, each generation is slowly taking into account the science and what.
I think that's right. But what we need to be very careful of, I think, is to these if you like, myths, whatever we want to call them, these illusions, are bound up very much with our conception of ourselves, of our relations to other people, and to some extent they're bound up with our identity as as human beings, as persons, and certainly some people think that they're central to our humanity, and that if we lose them, then we lose our humanity. People thought this about religion, of course, about belief in the soul and so on. Now, I don't think they are. I think we can develop a richer sense, a sense of humanity that is based on a more accurate self-conception, an accurate conception of the world, that being more accurate is more reliable and more sound. It gives us more purchase on the world, but that also supports an equally rich, if not richer, sense of humanity. I think the truth, does liberate us and makes us. But we don't need to concern ourselves with the worry that some people may feel they're losing their humanity when they lose these things. I'm not a person who likes to go out and attack religious belief, because I think it's doing a lot of important work for people.
Oh, certainly, definitely.
And by all means, we need to work on developing better belief systems. But you don't just kick away somebody's support and offer them nothing else. You need to help them forward. You need to help them see that they don't necessarily need those supports. There are other supports. Maybe they don't need supports at all in some areas, and in other cases there are other supports that are better. But this has got to be a gradual, sensitive process. We mustn't just we must take care. I don't want to be hard-headedly sort of scientistic about this. I think that's dreadful. That's dangerous.
No, I completely agree. I think doing that might cause more damage to the theory in itself.
Absolutely.
I think at the moment you become so antagonistic to a point where people just cannot relate to you in any way.
I think it's bad public relations. I think it's bad, but I think it's also dangerous. I mean, at the end of a recent talk by Dennett, which I really liked, he said something about religion. I know he's been associated, with the atheist movement, and he does think that religion does a great deal of damage in the world, and he's worked hard to combat that. But at the same time, he's quite sensitive to the value that religion gives to people's lives. And he said something that I really liked. He said there's something about religion that it offers this conception of something like family, where when you go, they have to take you in. When you knock on the door, they have to take you in. It's got that notion of acceptance and forgiveness and love. And yes, you don't want to go around trashing an attitude that supports that. Mm-hmm. You want to help people see that those attitudes don't necessarily need the support of a supernaturalist religion, that there are other ways of grounding those attitudes perhaps better. But you certainly don't want to be insensitive to that. And I don't think Dennett would be, and I certainly wouldn't want to be.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think there's so many aspects to it. And I think Dennett also talks about, I think they talk about the fact that, for example, if you look at some of the art, some of the magnificent things that come out of these religions, there's so much that they add so much complexity to the story as well. But that doesn't take away the fact that the real story, I mean, the fact that our atoms are formed in stars, or the fact that our molecules have taken billions of years to evolve into this. I mean, these stories are also quite magnificent. These are genuinely almost spiritual stories. When you talk, if someone can talk about it in a way that sounds spiritual, I think a lot more people will have access to it.
Look, it all comes from us in the end. The glory of the religious art is not God-given, it's human-given. It's a human response to life and their own experience filtered through this set of religious ideas and images. But it's an expression of humanity, expression of us. And the wonder of all this comes from us. And we can be equally wondrous in the way that we respond to scientific frameworks, equally creative, equally, I mean, again, going back to Humphrey, we just need to carry on being human, to carry on being the rather amazing and occasionally awful, but endlessly creative species that we are, whether it's within a religious framework, a scientific framework, whatever. Yes. That's where the wonder and the joy and the humanity comes from, not from something outside ourselves. And I think once you see that, it is kind of liberating, really, because you're not dependent on this framework of ideas. You're free to explore and free to try to get to grips with this. I mean, one of the you talked earlier about this idea of, the way that we've always tried to center ourselves in the universe. And in a way that's right, because we are filtering it all. We are the ones who have, but don't think that somehow it's all just somehow dependent on us. It's all there in its wonder. We are just reflecting it. We're just, mirrors to all this wondrous stuff.
Yes, it can lead to some sort of a solipsistic perspective. Once you take it a little too far, I think it definitely does tend to lead itself that way. But overall, I think when people adopt this, the main idea is to always remember that, I think in my essay, I quote Dumbledore from Harry Potter. I say, talks to Harry, says, just because it's happening in your head, Harry, doesn't mean it isn't real. I mean, it's I think to say the similar thing about consciousness, a phenomenal consciousness, because it's not real, doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously, or we should still take these contents seriously because it's part of our existence. This is exactly who we are. But that does not necessarily mean we should take it literally.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. It's yes. Again, the analogy with fiction. Fiction is wonderfully important. Often more important than just newspaper reports. Much more important, because it's much more expressive.
On that note, Keith, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I really appreciate the time you've taken out to chat to me. I mean, it was very fascinating. We touched on so many different things. Anything you want to say before we conclude the show? Anything? I think the floor is yours.
We've talked for we've talked a long time, and it's gone very quickly.
I had no idea that much time had gone by.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it. Look, I've done so much pontificating and lecturing. I don't think I can't just wrap it all up.
You can continue for as long as you want, but
I think I've talked myself out, really. So I really just want to thank you. One of the lovely things that's happened recently, I think, is podcasts, because it's a conversation that we're having. You and I are having a conversation. I have conversations with other people in podcasts, and people can listen to these podcasts and they can comment and they can get involved in different ways. I think this is a really positive thing, that we can have these conversations and we can share them and we can talk things through, because that's how we're going to solve things. We're not going to solve them. Academics can go and reflect on these ideas and develop theories and play these complicated chess games. But if they're going to have any effect in the world, they need to share these ideas, and people need to find these ideas useful to them. In their, particularly, I think, in philosophy of mind and mind sciences generally, this stuff has to help people in some way. It has to be stuff they can use to understand themselves better. So sharing this is absolutely vital. And it's not a matter, I don't see it as a matter of me coming here and saying, oh, this is the truth and I found it out and so on. I mean, I sometimes talk that way because I'm trying to put across my ideas, but I don't see it that way. This is a contribution to a conversation. All I ask is that people try it out. Try out this idea. Try it on. You're not going to just get the idea just by reading the headline. You'll need to think a bit about it and try and think yourself into the position and see if it helps. And if you try it on and you try to look at things this way and it doesn't help, well, okay. But just try it. Give it a try. And I think that's actually a good moral in many areas of life. Just let's listen to each other a little bit more. Try and share each other's perspectives. Don't just inhabit our own little egocentric bubbles. See things through other people's eyes. Take what you can from that. Build on it. Use it. Share what you can share with them. That's how we move forward.
I completely agree. I think that is precisely the point, because while I may have similar views to you on consciousness, there's a reason why I still want to chat to people like Philip, others in the field, because it's so important for us to have this discourse. We have to find ways to find commonalities and also to spot the differences and try and understand why we have them. What biases are we holding? What led to this? It's very important to know that it's impossible to not have a bias. Evolved these traits.
We are just our biases. That is our cognition is just a whole set of biases. The trick is to have the right biases.
Or to at least have the bias that helps your life the best. I mean, as we were talking about, if we adopt this theory of illusionism, and if you are able to incorporate it into your life, all the better. It's just so much better if you can feel liberated, if you can feel as if this has contributed to you spiritually somehow, using the word spiritually in the sense that this has enlightened you, this has made you feel better. It has provided you with some depth and the essence that, although is not ontologically real, is epistemologically true for you.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's a great line to finish on. I'm happy with that.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.